Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Dahlia and I'm from Georgia, which is in the southeastern part of the United States, with exquisitely beautiful terrain that consists of pretty beaches, rolling verdant farmland and statuesque mountains. I live in the northern part of Georgia in an idyllic countrified Georgian-style home with a pretty pond, some undulating green lawns, a stables for our 3 horses, some grazing fields, a large apple orchard and a magnificent resplendent wood green consisting of maples, pines, oaks and hickories. My incredulous Bigfoot story begins in the summer of 2006 when I was living in my wholesome family home with my devoted husband Bob and my mischievous rambunctious son Alex, who was about 7 at the time. I'm afraid to have to admit that Alex was growing up to be a little scallywag and the biggest fibber of all time. As a mother, I had absolutely no comprehension of how elaborated, multifaceted and prodigious his lying had actually become. He was such an excellent liar that he could lie without batting an eyelid. Alex always wanted to be one better than anybody else in his entire class at school, and to convey much more dramatic, outlandish stories than anybody else, that would invariably make him become the centre of attention. On one occasion at school, the kids had to talk about their mother in front of the class and describe what it was about their mothers that made them unusually special, as it was all in aid of Mother's Day. Paul, one of the boys, got up and told everyone in the class, "My mummy only has one breast, 'cause the other one got cut off because of cancer. Daddy says mummy's very, very brave." Everyone was exclaiming how sorry they were for his poor mother, and how incredibly brave she was. "Miss Cooper? Miss Cooper?" "Yes, Alex, what is it?" "My mummy had both of her breasts cut off. She's also got a wooden leg as well. My mummy's braver than Paul's." "Well, your mother's very brave, but so is Paul's." Everybody was so shocked, and of course my son delighted in the attention he received. The teacher agreed heartily that I was very brave indeed. Then another boy called Derek got up and proceeded to tell everybody that he had 2 fathers because his mother recently got divorced, which meant he got twice as many Christmas gifts at Christmas every year. Once again, my assiduous little boy raised his hand and said, "Miss Cooper? Miss Cooper?" "Yes, Alex, what is it?" "My mummy has been married for 5 times, so I have 5 daddies and 5 times more Christmas presents." When Alex made up these melodramatic, magnified claims, he received so much attention from everyone. I was to learn that some of the children's parents would actually pack an extra cookie in their kids' lunchbox just for Alex. Give that to the poor boy, whose mother's got a wooden leg, they would say. Bless him. Mrs. Cooper, his teacher, also showed him special attention, which he lapped up like a dog that was given an extra helping of sausage. Imagine what everybody secretly thought about me. I was the poor kid's mother that was wobbling around precariously on one wooden leg with no breasts and had been through hundreds of failed marriages with 5 different fathers. I mean, it didn't get worse than that, did it? What kind of a bizarre picture was my son painting of me? But what gets me the most is everybody believed him. None of these stories were true, of course, but they circulated around the school like a rampant wildfire that was out of control. I would always notice the mothers at the school gate glancing surreptitiously at my legs and chest, and I began to feel quite self-conscious. One day it was the egg and spoon race at Alex's school, and Alex's teacher, Mrs. Cooper, went to the trouble of singling me out for special favour. She brought me a comfortable upholstered chair to sit on in order to watch the games, while everybody else was sitting on plastic, very uncomfortable chairs. It made me feel very awkward, as everybody was staring at me, and I hated being the centre of attention. Mrs. Cooper nudged me and assured me that I didn't have to take part in the egg and spoon race under the delicate circumstances of my condition. I had no idea what she was talking about, but I was so embarrassed and humiliated that I never said a word and just sat there like a great big lump of cookie dough, looking like a complete and utter idiot, and wishing with all my heart that the ground would swallow me whole. On one occasion when I was picking up Alex from school, a random woman came dashing up to me with a piteous, concerned look on her face, handing me a book with the title, How to Keep Your Husband Still Interested in You Years After Your Marriage. I think you will find it very useful, she said. There's some good pointers in there to keep the spark alive in your marriage. I remember thinking, what a hell of a cheek! Why would a strange woman I'd never seen a day in my life have the brass nerve, insolence and contempt to present me with such a peculiar book? Was she trying to suggest that my husband was losing interest in me? That was very hard to stomach. Then there was another time when one of the garrulous mothers at Alex's school invited me out for lunch to ask me for special advice as she was getting divorced, and proceeded to go into avid detail about the hopeless, dilapidated state of her broken marriage. It's so good to share all this with someone who really understands what I'm going through, she exclaimed. The excitable woman couldn't stop talking about herself. She barely stopped to draw breath. She then asked me if I could recommend a good divorce lawyer for her. I told her I didn't know any good divorce lawyers, and I was desperately sorry about that. I wished I could have been of better help. Oh, that's so terrible, she exclaimed. You must have had such rotten luck. You poor, poor thing, she said, taking my hand and squeezing it. I remember thinking how strange it was that someone should ask me for legal advice. I mean, what did I know about the law? My husband thought that the woman might believe I was in the legal profession, a lawyer or something. If that wasn't enough weirdness for you, I was asked by the school principal to represent a cancer charity at the school, which I did think was decidedly odd, given that I'd never had cancer myself. I'm sure everybody would love to hear your story, I was told. But I haven't got a story to tell, I assured her. Now, my dear, don't be so modest. I'm sure you have quite a story to tell. And in my book, it's women like you that are my heroes. I can only imagine the pretentious and theatrical stories my son continued to make up at school, but at home he lied non-stop about everything as well. He would tell me that his teddy bear could talk Hebrew. I would humour him and say, "Oh, that's nice, sweetheart. Maybe he can teach you how to speak it." "He doesn't want to teach me," he said. "Oh, that's a pity," I said. "He's not a very nice teddy bear then, is he?" One day when I scolded my son for spilling his drink all over the kitchen floor as an act of defiance because I told him he needed to bath, and he absolutely loathed bathing, he told me that he didn't like me, and neither did the horses in our stable, who had personally told him what a dreadful mother I was, and that they didn't like me at all. At this my husband laughed and asked him why the horses didn't like Mummy. You could see my son trying to think fast on his feet with what crazy fabricated story he could come up with next. "They don't like her, 'cause she's very, very smelly." "What does Mummy smell of, Alex?" my husband asked. "She smells like a pig," my son said. Lovely, I thought. My son is quite the charmer. One weekend when my elderly mother who was looking after Alex, while my husband and I went away for a romantic weekend break together, I returned home to see my mother looking at me with enraged, furious eyes. I'd never seen her this fired up before. She looked mad as hell. "How could you?" she said. "I didn't raise you to be like this." "What's wrong, Mum?" I asked. "I know what you did to my grandchild," she informed me. "Alex told me everything, and quite frankly, I'm utterly appalled and disgusted with you. I never thought a daughter of mine was capable of this abysmal treatment. He's only a child, for goodness sake. This is tantamount to abuse." "What did I do, Mum?" I groaned. "Out with it now." "Alex told me how you locked him up in his bedroom for an entire day and night, with no food, when he was very naughty. You can't do that to a growing little boy. He also told me that you confiscated all his toys for 2 whole weeks, so he had nothing to play with at all. How could you be so heartless and cruel?" "That's not true, Mum," I said. "I never locked him in his room. He's lying to you. And I've never confiscated his toys, ever." I was to discover that my little conniving, masterful little boy had successfully bamboozled his grandmother to buy him all the toys he'd been begging us to get him for ages. We had firmly both told him no, and it would seem that he had cunningly managed to manipulate his grandmother by pretending he'd been so hard done by both his parents. For in my mother's disgust at my appalling parenting techniques, my mother had brought Alex absolutely everything he wanted, with no expense spared, toy cars and the likes, and he looked like the cat that had got the cream. He was quick in learning that this guileful technique of his had huge fringe benefits and payoffs that were very rewarding. As you can imagine, I was growing increasingly concerned about my son's reckless, unbridled fibbing, because it was getting seriously out of hand as far as I was concerned. I even sent him to a very well-known psychologist who assured me he'd grow out of the lying, and he was possibly making these stories up to be the centre of attention, which was something I already knew. "Your son is as bright as a button," he told me. "Granted he's lying and makes up stories all the time, but he has a quick-witted, fertile imagination which should never be crushed or stifled. On the contrary, it should be encouraged. It's kids like him that end up becoming inspirational great novelists like the Stephen Kings of this world. You do not want to discourage his creative imagination. You need to humour him. Of course, as he gets older, you need to get a little tough on him if he's becoming rather headstrong, audacious and undisciplined, for he does need to know right from wrong." After meeting with the psychologist, I was feeling a lot better, but I was to learn from one of the mothers at school that after one of the kids at school announced that her parents ate snails and garlic along with frog legs in France, everyone upon listening to this proceeded to express their shock and distaste at such a thing. My little boy piped, "Well, Miss Cooper, my mum eats crawling snails and frogs from the garden like sweets." Everybody went, "Ugh, that is so disgusting." And of course Alex loved it. So now everybody believed that Alex had a one-legged mother with no breasts that got through as many husbands as people eat hot dinners and was feasting on garden snails and frogs like sweets. And let's not forget, I smelt atrocious like a pig, and my horses didn't like me either. There was one occasion when not trusting my son backfired on me, when Alex informed me in a nonchalant way that there was a fire ablaze in the kitchen, burning down the kitchen blinds, and of course I didn't believe him. Finally I got to smell the rancid smoke for myself and raced to the kitchen in a desperate panic. I had accidentally left a pan of oil on the gas hob to cook some sausages for Alex, and I had become distracted and forgotten all about it, and my kitchen nearly went down in flames, but I fought the flames with my fire extinguisher and thankfully won that battle. Like many parents, I did find putting Alex in front of the television did help to entertain him and keep him occupied, and he liked all kinds of programmes, including stories about Bigfoot. Indeed, he was so enamoured and fascinated by Bigfoot that he spoke of nothing else. One day he told me that Bigfoot was knocking on his window at night and beckoning to him to go and play with him outside. I remember saying, "That's nice, dear. Why don't you go and play with him?" I was getting increasingly tired of his incorrigible lies. Before long, Alex was telling me all kinds of tall stories about a little boy Bigfoot called Applejack that was playing ball with him with the plums in the orchard, and that his mother Sagebrush had a long jagged scar down her torso and big sad eyes. Alex told me that he'd given Applejack some of his toy cars because it made him so happy, and they loved playing together. I just said, "That's a very interesting story, dear," and that I was pleased that he was generous with his toys. Alex informed me that Applejack lived in the forest with Sagebrush and was very lonely and sad because his dad and brother were both dead, as they'd been killed by a couple of nasty hunters with guns. As you can imagine, I naturally assumed my son was up to his old tricks, making up all these incredulous stories, but I must admit I was impressed with what a proficient storyteller he was, and with what imaginative names he'd come up with, although it was such a pity it was all lies. After all, you can only cry wolf so many times. Every time I needed a babysitter, which was actually quite often, as my husband and I were quite social and went out regularly, I would hire our next-door neighbour's girl called Chantelle, who was always eager to make some money. She was a pretty slender 17-year-old girl with long dark hair, blue eyes and fair skin. Chantelle was permanently superglued to her cell phone all day and night, always tapping away at the keys of her cell non-stop, like a proficient secretary. I would sometimes hear the tail end of her conversation, and it was invariably always about boys. "Oh, he's so cute," she'd gush. "Or I went out with him once and he was real loser. Don't give him a second look." I knew then that even though her young head was permanently in the clouds and caught up in her girly telephone conversations, she was still reliable enough to take care of Alex, as long as she managed to multitask and look up from her cell phone from time to time, just to ensure Alex wasn't getting up to too much mischief. My son absolutely adored Chantelle, and they would order pizza together, eat lots of ice cream and watch television. And he would chatter away, filling her head with all kinds of fictitious, marvellous stories. He even told her that my husband had a glass eye once, and Chantelle actually believed him. I had warned Chantelle of my son's overactive imagination and his ardent passion for telling fibs all the time, and she knew better than to rely on a single word he told her. But sometimes it was hard to doubt him, because he was an artful liar at the very best of times. One day when I returned home, I discovered that Chantelle looked panicked and dismayed, because my son Alex was nowhere to be found. "He told me he was going to play with Bigfoot, and I just humoured him," she said. "But when I looked up from my cell phone, he'd just vanished." "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Madison," she cried. I really should have been more careful." "Calm down," I said. "Put down your cell for once in your life, and let's find him together. He can't have gone that far." As any mother will tell you, losing a kid is a mother's worst, most terrifying nightmare, as all kinds of horrific scenarios go ripping and racing through your head at 1,000 miles an hour. And one of the most dreadful and ghastly of all is the prospect of drowning. The haunting thought that Alex, who couldn't swim, may have wandered off to the pond and accidentally fallen into the depths of the deep, cold, icy water sent waves of dread through my entire being. This kind of nightmare can all too easily happen to the best of us, as any parent will tell you. I had warned Alex not to go near that pond on countless occasions, but he was a disobedient rogue at the very best of times. I was in too much of a flurry to think clearly, as terror literally shot through my body like a steam train on full throttle, and in my blind panic, I began to function like a robot on autopilot. I literally dived into that pond in all my clothes, feeling around desperately for my son beneath the icy cold, freezing water, but there was no sign of him, much to my relief. In my rampaging frenzy, I gallivanted around the whole house like a bull in a china shop, frantically dripping water everywhere from my soaking clothes that literally clung to my body like sopping rags. Then I darted aimlessly around to the apple orchards and stables with the alarmed Chantelle running behind me. I kept shouting out his name in desperation. "Alex! Alex! Alex! Where are you, Alex?" Finally, there was one place I hadn't searched. It was the wood green, but Alex knew he wasn't allowed to go in there on his own. I told Chantelle to take her car and drive around the neighbourhood looking for Alex, while I searched the woods. As I ran into the wooded area, I could hear Alex's raised, animated voice along with laughter and chuckles. The relief I felt was overwhelming. Without a second thought, I raced towards his voice, stopping dead in my tracks because I could barely believe what I was discerning. My son was seated on the ground next to a little 3-foot Bigfoot that was possibly as young as he was, and they were playing with his selection of cars together. Both of them were making similar brimming sounds, brrr, brrr, and dragging their cars on the ground and occasionally colliding into each other and crashing. The little Bigfoot looked so human-like it was almost uncanny, only he was covered in long golden brown hair and had exceedingly long arms and a pyramid-shaped head with very soulful animated golden eyes. Standing in watch over my son and the little Bigfoot was a guardian-like large female Bigfoot, and the sheer size of her was so intimidating that I was overwhelmed and seized with absolute, total and utter terror. In that moment I stood there on the spot, frozen like a block of ice, hardly daring to move. I would say she was about 8 foot tall, 600 pounds, and although she was slim, I could see that every single area of her body was covered in dense muscle. I noticed that the hair over her large breasts and her chest area was exceedingly scant, and I could see that there was a nasty-looking jagged scar running down her chest to above the top of her streamlined belly. I am almost certain that those were scars caused from gunshots, which made me feel very queasy and very ashamed of being human. I could tell someone had definitely tried to kill her. Suddenly sensing my presence, the female turned around, swiveling her head and shoulders together in my direction, and she looked up at me, and our eyes met for a moment. I could feel the sadness and turmoil within the depths of her golden eyes, and I knew she was a creature that was grieving a dreadful, calamitous loss in her life. It would seem that she really was suffering emotionally. After looking directly at her eyes, my fears dissipated as fast as the steam from a kettle, for I perceived that she was very kind. I spoke gently to her and pointed to my son, saying, "I've come to get my boy." The female Bigfoot seemed to understand and called out to her own son in a chattering sound that sounded rather like she was calling his name, and he abandoned the toy cars he was playing with and ran obediently to her side, watching me ever so curiously. I walked over to Alex and hugged him, sobbing slightly as I cradled him in my arms. "Oh, Alex," I cried, "you gave me such a scare." I took him by his little hand and led him away, glancing directly at the female Bigfoot, and our eyes locked again in an understanding. She stood there not moving a muscle or flinching, as she watched me silently, walking away with Alex. "But, Mummy, I want to play with Applejack. I want to play with Applejack." During the weeks and days that followed, I never told my husband, nor anybody else that matter, about the Bigfoot that I'd encountered in the woods. It wasn't because I cared whether people believed me or not, but because I was trying to digest what I'd seen and come to terms with it myself. I knew at once that the benevolent, benign and congenial mother Bigfoot would never ever harm Alex. I found myself thinking about her all the time. My heart went out to her. I wondered all about her personal tragic story, and who had shot her, and whether my son's story about her family being taken out by hunters was in fact true. I began to suspect it was an accurate account, and a very likely scenario, and I felt strangely protective towards the poor female Bigfoot and her son, as life had been callously cruel for the both of them, and they certainly deserved better. I knew if they stayed on our land that they would be safe, although as incongruous as it sounds, I did hope that they would keep their distance from Alex. I didn't want to encourage my son's relationship with the little Bigfoot, because Bigfoots are so massive that if they play rough with you, they could ultimately harm you or even kill you, based just on their huge size. I instructed my son that he wasn't to play with the little Bigfoot again, and he promised me he wouldn't, and I never actually saw the Bigfoots again, which was a mixed bag of blessings for me. This is my son's side of the story. Hi, I'm Alex, and I assure you that my mother is not exaggerating at all about my terrible lying when I was growing up. For some reason I loved making up all kinds of stories, as it made me become the centre of attention, and I loved that. I also enjoyed shocking people and telling them things that would really horrify them and make them gasp with astonishment, as their reactions were always fabulous. I've always enjoyed stirring the pot, and even as a teenager, I was the biggest prankster ever. When I was little, I found there were amazing perks to making up stories like treats and gifts that I would be given all the time. I made the most terrible, outrageous stories up about my mother, and everybody thought that she had a wooden leg and no breasts and feasted on our garden snails. I told everyone that my dad had a glass eye and was missing all the toes on his feet, and that shocked people as well. The funny part of it all was that people actually believed me, but it was like the high you get from drugs. The more sensational my lies became, the more shocked my audience, the greater the buzz. I think I was a fabulous manipulator, even if I say so myself. Of course, when I did encounter Applejack and told my mother about the experience, she never believed me, and frankly, who could blame her? After all, there are only so many times you can cry wolf. It was such a long time ago when I had that friendship with Applejack, and his really sweet mother Sagebrush, but I do seem to remember knowing that his whole family had been killed by hunters, and his mother Sagebrush had managed to escape with her life after receiving multiple gunshots to her chest area. I remember she had a jagged, ugly scar down her front where her hair could not grow back. I do not know how she survived, but she actually did, and thankfully was able to raise Applejack. I sensed that she was not bitter nor hateful towards human beings, but she was sad and lonely. I think she felt her kind are often misunderstood and harshly judged. I played with her little one all the time, but I knew it would be short-lived, because they told me that they never stayed in one place for very long, as they were nomads, wandering from one place to another. Also, Sagebrush wanted to find her sister Merrylegs, as she was so desperately lonely without any adult company of her own kind. It's weird. I do often wonder to myself how I knew all this information, but I truly think my mind was fed all this by the Bigfoots in some form of telepathic exchange, of which I cannot explain, because I would just know things about them in my mind, like what their names were, their plans for the future, the cave that they lived in the woods, and stuff like that. I must confess, even though my mother told me never to play with Applejack again, I firmly disobeyed her, and would surreptitiously sneak out at night to visit him in the woods, and we would play together in the large cave covered with deerskins. I really loved Applejack and Sagebrush, as they were so friendly and convivial towards me. I would often raid our fridge and bring them fruits and biscuits, which they loved to eat. I do not believe that Bigfoots would have ever hurt me, as they were more gentle than any humans I know. One day they told me they were going away, and I literally cried and cried for days. I do remember that. I never ever saw them again, and I do miss them. I am now 21 years old, and my focus is to become a fictional writer of horror, which may be why I've always loved to shock people in the past. Perhaps all the incessant lying as a kid helped my fertile imagination after all. And who knows, one day I might be the next Stephen King. So for all the non-believers out there, Bigfoot is real. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, the sky was a smouldering grey colour. It had darkened in mere moments, almost as if it had forgotten the time of day it actually was, and hurriedly fast-forwarded itself to early evening, when in reality it was only 1:20 in the afternoon. A few more dark clouds rolled ominously across the sky, like an inauspicious omen, leaving behind a smouldering signature with a less than agreeable message, as if to warn anyone that was actually paying any attention that a storm was brewing, and by the looks of things, this was going to be a cantankerous one at that. I was standing at the kitchen window at the time, when the sky had darkened significantly. I had been chopping onions, and my eyes were watering profusely. I soon forgot about my chopping, as I held my knife in my hand above my chopping board, midway through the task, staring out at the sky through the window, almost as if locked under a hypnotic kind of trance. I couldn't help but think that the sky looked uncharacteristically menacing. I was supposed to be making a cheese and mushroom quiche for dinner that evening, but the sudden dip in light frequency had grabbed my immediate attention, as dark shadows floated around the kitchen,
so that I was forced to put on the kitchen light to cast them all away, or otherwise I'd not be able to see clearly as to what I was doing. I wiped away the stinging tears that had gathered in my eyes from all the onion juices that were making me weep, and I continued to chop. I kept surreptitiously glancing out of the window that overlooked the front yard, the pavement, and the street beyond. I heard the crows cawing loudly. They flew eagerly towards the naked dead tree, where they flocked together in dark clusters. The tree towered up into the pewter sky, like a couple of large, white, bony, skeletal arms that were reaching out into the heavens as if they wanted to grab a star out of the sky. This is what I considered to be the watchtower on my property, where the crows would gather together frequently. I loved this tree since I was a little girl, and I had no intention of bringing it down any time soon. And now that I had fortunately inherited my late mother's home, I would surely keep it that way, as even my late mother had loved that dead tree, with its sculptural dignity, as it swept up in the sky like the Statue of Liberty. If you were a contemporary artist of note, you would have appreciated the dignified symmetry of the dead tree, rather like a sculptural piece of illustrious artwork that you might thoroughly enjoy observing at a museum of art, that Mother Nature had inspired herself. The crows always gave me due warning as to when it would rain, or if a storm was on the horizon, as their behaviour was more reliable than the notoriously fickle Spokane weather reports that could never be trusted to be relied upon, unless you wanted to find yourself caught up in the rain. Let's not kid. Washington state weather was like an unfaithful mistress that would always let you down, misbehaving with her flailing promises, as faithfulness was not her middle name. I watched in fascination and curious intrigue as the crows gathered together on the gnarled bough of the dead tree in my front yard, filling the air with their caw-caw sounds. I'm quite sure some of my neighbours probably thought the dead tree should have been brought to its knees a long time ago, but I found its statuesque beauty rather inspirational, and beyond that it was a great lookout point for the crows. I could see them flapping around uneasily as they settled down on the branches, and although some people see crows as a symbol of impending doom, I had always loved the birds. When I was young I raised a baby crow that had fallen from its nest to adulthood, and when I released it back into the wild, it would come back to visit me year after year. It was so incredibly tame. Even my less than agreeable mother had been enchanted by the little bird, and in awe of its incredible intelligence. That clever bird would perch on my shoulder, eating food out of the palm of my hands. It had such a gentle spirit, and was always drawn to anything shiny. The bird visited me for years and years, as he never forgot how I'd saved him from uncertain death, and probably saw me as a maternal figure in his life. One summer I never saw him again, and I knew that I never would, as I expected my feathery friend had finally succumbed to old age, like we all inevitably do in the end. I had called the crow Barker because of the cawing sound he would make. I believe some of Barker's progeny would hang out on top of the dead tree, and knowing that always brought me considerable comfort and made me feel naturally protective towards all the crows. When I moved back into my childhood home, against my husband's seasoned advice, I had sighed with relief that my mother had saved that dead tree. Maybe she did have some redeeming qualities after all, that I had failed to fully appreciate as a teenager, when I had considered her the most ruthlessly condemning person that I'd ever had the privilege to know, who adopted her own formidable views over everything to suit her willful agenda. Then it happened. The heavens released their wrath, and the rain came bolting down spiritedly in sheets, beating down furiously against the window panes, and tapping the glass like a witch's fingernails. Then I heard the distant roll of thunder, becoming more and more pronounced, until it felt far too close for my own personal comfort, as if it was about to come trumpeting through our living room like a rambunctious herd of elephants. I knew the storm was going to be a bad one. I could feel it in the atmosphere and almost taste it on my tongue. I needed to close the upstairs window in my bedroom before my newly fitted wooden floors became sprinkled with water to prevent them from getting damaged. I'd only recently replaced some of the warped floorboards in the bedroom, and I didn't want my brand new floor to be ruined by rain trespassing into the house through the open windows. I hurriedly dashed up the long, winding, rather ornate wrought-iron staircase of my home, taking 2 eager steps at a time, in my haste to get to the master bedroom. I very nearly tripped over my grey and white cat, Eartha, who was happily preening herself on one of the steps, giving herself a once-over. She was totally unconcerned and unperturbed by the raging storm that was now gathering fast momentum outside our home. Nothing ever phrased that cat. I bulleted into the master bedroom. The long white curtains billowed against the window like a couple of large white sails on a boat out at sea. The wind had wilfully discharged its feisty gusts into the bedroom, so it was whipping the curtains backwards and forwards. I hurriedly dashed towards the window to close it as quickly as I could. But before I got there, I noticed a pool of water from the rain puddling all over the floor. I sighed in frustration. I didn't need my wooden floors to be damaged, so I hurriedly grabbed a towel from the bathroom to mop it all up. I jumped out of my skin as a huge, intrusive clapping sound of thunder walloped through the sky, with a thunderous, mighty crash that was so loud the sound went right through me. This was followed by the bright light from a formidable flash of lightning that lit up my entire bedroom like a powerful camera flash. The forceful sound from the claps of thunder startled me, leaving me trembling in my boots, as the sound almost left my ears ringing. I hurriedly pulled back the curtains that were squeaking loudly. I closed the window behind me, and then a sudden movement from the front yard in my peripheral vision caught my immediate attention, and my blood turned to ice. It was him again! Why wouldn't he leave me alone? Who was he? I saw the ambiguous figure sporting a black umbrella, standing on the edge of our front yard, facing away from the street. The head was clandestinely, as always, covered in a black hoodie, so I had no way of being able to discern who this person actually was. The grim figure stood there staring right up at me. I couldn't see whether the person in question was male or female, as the dark, loose-fitting clothes they sported made them appear ambiguously vague, and it didn't help that they were wearing a hoodie all the time. But I suspected the figure was that of a man, given he appeared reasonably tall and seemed to have large shoulders. Whoever they were, I reasoned they could be anyone, but more to the point, they had been watching me, and had been doing so since I'd moved into Silver Lake's house. Furthermore, if that wasn't bad enough, I had been receiving hostile notes dropped through the letterbox addressed personally to me. These notes were written in capital letters in black Sharpie on a pink cardboard background, containing horrible messages like, "I'm watching you. I'll make you pay for what you did. And when you look out of the window on a lonely night, I will be there watching you." Then there were other messages like, "Revenge is a dish best served cold, and you're going to freeze." And finally, "I know your dirty secret. I might just let the cat out of the bag." I had hidden all these nasty, threatening notes away from my husband, not knowing what on earth they meant, but they were a source of great disquiet for me. Someone was clearly intent on making mischief and causing me great distress. The quintessential question was why. My heart pounded violently in my chest, booming so loudly that it almost became louder than the thunder out of doors. I had seen this figure over 6 times before, always watching me, as they had threatened to do so in their notes. They were clearly fulfilling their promises to me. The man or woman, whoever they were, hovering around on the pavement bordering my yard, was just staring up at me from under the veil of their black hoodie, which means I had no way of knowing who they were. What did this person want, I wondered. I hurriedly closed the window, pulling the curtains across to avoid seeing the figure any more, as if the action would block them out of my life for good. Yet I knew it wouldn't. In an impetuous, impulsive moment of morbid curiosity, I peeked again through the open crack in the curtain to see if the figure had finally gone away, now that the curtains were closed. No such luck. He or she was still staring right up at the upper floor window, as if they were hell-bent on intimidating me. Why wouldn't he go away? Leave me alone, for goodness sake. I suddenly felt a sharp tap on my back. I jumped out of my skin. I was so affrighted, turning around to see my husband Lenny. He had entered the master bedroom. He was giving me a friendly nudge. The moment could have not been more inopportune, as I was rattled by the figure standing in our front yard. It was not as if the stranger was trespassing, as our front yard stretched out to the pavement, but he was watching me, and that was the problem. "I wish you wouldn't do that, Lenny, creeping up on me like that. You gave me quite the shock, you did."
"Sorry, sweetheart. Are you all right? You do look as if you've seen a ghost. Your face is drained of all its colour. I didn't mean to scare you half to death."
"Well, you did. You freaked me out, Lenny. Look at me. My nerves are absolutely fried. That crack of thunder scared me half to death. And then to top it all off, you pounce on me like this unawares. Of course I'm going to be startled." Lenny furrowed his brow, fixing his steely gaze on me, as if studying me intently. "What? Why are you looking at me like that, Lenny?"
"It's not just the raging storm outside that is scaring you, is it, Olivia? Although this is going to be a bad one for sure. But something else has been bothering you. Ever since we've moved here to the Silver Lakes house, you've become so jittery. You keep looking over your shoulders, almost as if you think someone's going to pounce on you. You've become very skittish of late. I'm worried about you, sweetheart. You're not your usual happy-go-lucky self."
I could feel myself going immediately defensive. As heat rose up my arms, neck and face, I began to flush. My skin was burning and growing a bright red colour. My husband could never be allowed to know about the figure that was stalking me, and the nasty notes that had been delivered for me in the letterbox. "What are you talking about, Lenny?" I snapped, glaring at him furiously, almost as if daring him to say something that he might possibly regret. My husband shifted uncomfortably in his very stylish caramel loafers that always looked rather trendy on his feet. My husband looked good in everything he wore. He was a handsome man who had no comprehension of how attractive he actually was. He had those surfer looks, blonde hair spilling down to his shoulders, piercing blue eyes, and golden sun-kissed skin. But what I liked about him the most was he had no idea how good-looking he was. He tapped one of his shoes apprehensively on our wooden floor. I could see his jaw tightening, as if he was wondering whether he should say what was playing on his mind or not. He could sense by my warning tone of voice that I might be reactive to whatever he was going to say, and Lenny hated confrontations and arguments of any kind that would wantonly steal the peace in our household. "Go on, say it, Lenny. What's on your mind? You might as well say it because I know you want to."
"It's just, sweetie, since we moved here to the Silver Lakes house, belonging to your late mother, you've been a little on edge. Actually, if the truth be told, that's an understatement. You've been a lot on edge. I did warn you many, many times that moving back to your childhood home might not be a very good, auspicious idea in the long term, especially given some of your unfortunate childhood memories you had living here with your formidable no-nonsense mother."
"And what's that supposed to mean, Lenny? Spill it out, will you? Tell me what you mean."
Lenny drew in a deep breath. "Well, you and your mother had a volatile relationship at the best of times, especially when you were a teenager. It makes no sense to me that you want to live in a home where you and your mother were at loggerheads with each other all the time. Surely living here brings back some of those less than rosy memories for you. Is it any wonder you feel unsettled living here? You're probably being permanently reminded of her all the time. Think about it. You never visited your mother when she was dying, did you? There was no love lost between the two of you. So why would you want to live in your mother's old home? It beats me. It really does. I just don't get it. Try and make me understand, love, because I'm finding it incredibly hard to do so. I love my childhood home, Lenny. I've told you that multiple times. And I did not know my mother was dying, Lenny. Don't you remember, or have you conveniently forgotten all about that? My mother left me a message to say she needed to speak to me. I ignored her message. I didn't want to talk to her. I had nothing to say. If I'd known she was dying, of course I would have visited her. Don't you think I regret not saying my goodbyes to her? It might have been an opportunity to mend our differences. Not that I think that would have ever been possible. I'm sure even in death my mother was probably as cantankerously disagreeable as ever. I doubt her cancer diagnosis changed her at all. She was always a very bitter woman, especially after my father died. I am sure you have your regrets, sweetie. We all do. I just assumed you would sell this place after you inherited it in your mother's will. I think your childhood home carries too many ghosts from the past. And in your case, some of those ghosts are going to cause great upset, which means that living here long term might be something you should seriously reconsider. And I don't say that lightly, love. I truly think a new start somewhere fresh might be a very good idea, don't you? We don't have to move back to Nova Scotia. We could if you wanted to, of course. But Washington is a big place. There are lots of lovely places we could live. We could move somewhere else in the area. But I really think we should sell your childhood home. I really do. I'm not going to reconsider anything, Lenny. I love Silver Lakes, and I'm definitely not selling her. I've put my blood, sweat and tears into fixing this place up, painstakingly bringing her back to her original condition. It took me weeks to clear out my mother's rubbish, with your help, of course. I know you've gone to a great deal of trouble fixing this place up, and you've done a sterling job. But it doesn't mean you should keep Silver Lakes. You're under no obligation to do so. But I love Silver Lakes, and I'm not going to abandon her. Yes, my mother was a difficult, petulant woman. But it was only when I was a teenager that things went badly awry between us. Believe it or not, I still have some happy memories of my childhood spent in this home, especially when my father was alive. Regretfully, after he died, my mother changed. That's when she became so abrasive and thorny towards me, and when I could do nothing right. But before that, things were actually good between us. I know all that, love. You've told me often enough. But it's just, Olivia, you're not yourself at the moment. It's like you're not as happy as you used to be as a person. It's like you're fading away before my eyes, sweetie. I can't remember the last time I actually saw you smiling. And do you know, smiling reveals a lot about a person's health. When a person is unhappy, they're unhealthy. And everything's gone sadly downhill since we moved here. You aren't eating terribly much. Another sign of your being unhappy. You look rail thin these days because you fail to eat. You toss and turn at night, unable to get to sleep. You seem on edge all the time. That's no way to have to live. Selling this place is just not going to happen, Lenny. I'm sorry it's not, I snapped. Don't you get it? Silver Lakes has been in my father's side of the family for 3 generations now. It's a stunningly beautiful home. I'm never going to sell it. Who said I'm not happy here? I didn't say that, did I? You didn't say you weren't happy here, but I can tell you're not happy, Olivia. I've known you for a long time, and I think the very reason you want to keep this house is out of loyalty to your father. But I'm quite sure that your father would not be happy for you to keep this place if you were unhappy in doing so. For your information, Lenny, I couldn't be happier living in my old childhood home. And yes, I do feel close to my father here. I'm glad you feel close to your dad, love. There is no doubt this is a beautiful home, sweetie. But that's all thanks to you. The way your mother Prudence left this place was absolutely shocking, and I mean shocking. How could she live in this house when she was dying of cancer is beyond me. We could barely get into the house, there was so much clutter lying all over the place, clogging up the doorways, obstructing the stairs. Old newspapers piled up high like the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Landmines of plastic bags full of items your mother would never get to use. She collected old pizza boxes she'd bought over the years, and empty shampoo bottles that she preserved in plastic bags. I mean, who does that? You sifted through all of your mother's junk, threw bucket loads of the stuff away, fixed this place up magnificently. But I thought you were only doing this with an end goal in mind, of ultimately selling this place to get the best possible price for it. I had absolutely no idea. Your ulterior motive was actually to move in here permanently. And when we did, well, I have to admit I felt a bit like a fish out of water. Even for me, it didn't feel right living in your old childhood home. And it still doesn't. I'm not sure coming back here to Silver Lakes was a good idea, love. I definitely have seen a very discernible change in your mood since we moved in.
What are you saying, Lenny? Is this your subtle way of telling me you don't like my mother's house? You prefer something infinitely more modern, is that it? I should have guessed. You like the minimal look, don't you?
Lenny frowned. Why do you always do that, Olivia? Putting words in my mouth that don't belong. Did I say that? No, I didn't. I did not say I didn't like your late mother's home. You're assuming I don't like it. I'm just saying there's a history to this house. It's a historic home. It goes way back in time, and you can feel it.
Of course you can feel it, because it's got oodles of character, Lenny. That's the whole point of a historic home.
That's exactly what I've been trying to say, love. Houses have history, especially houses like this. When I first saw Silver Lake's house and all the clutter your mother has accumulated here over the years, it looked like a tip, I will admit. At the time, I could not conceive in a million months of Sundays of anybody living here, least of all you and me, for want of a better word. Of course, I'm not surprised that you had a greater vision than I did. You saw the great potential of this place. And I will concede that you have transformed it into a stunning home. If you put it on the market, you could fetch a sizable amount of money for it. And that's what I suggest you do in the circumstances. Then you can put your past behind you and move forward to a brighter, more promising future.
Why would I want to do that, Lenny?
I said, raising a brow. Because your mother is still here, isn't she? I know she's long since dead, but I feel as if her energy is still around this house. It doesn't matter what you do to this place, love. It doesn't matter how many alterations. Her residual energy will remain. Don't forget she died in this house. I rolled my eyes in the back of my head in exasperation.
Honestly, Lenny, listen to yourself. You've never believed in ghosts before. You said all that stuff was woo-woo. And now you're saying my mother's haunting this place. Do you realize how ridiculous you sound? My mother has long gone. She's not around anymore. If she was, believe me, I'd be the first to know about it.
Sweetie, you've got me wrong. I never said I believed in ghosts. But I believe in energy. What is it that Tesla said? Everything is energy, frequency, vibration. That's how he said we should understand our universe. And he's right, you know. Sometimes energy is residual. It's left behind, even long after the person has died. It's a little like cleaning out a fish tank and being unable to remove some of the resolutely stubborn algae that is stuck there for a lifetime. And no matter how hard you scrub it away, it just won't shift. Something is always left behind. Don't you see what I'm trying to say? I think your mother's essence is in this house. And that's what I believe is upsetting you greatly. You never got along with her in life, yet you want to still live in her house after her death. And I believe her residual energy is still hanging around here. It makes no sense to me at all. I hate seeing you grievously upset like this. I think living here has brought you great disquiet.
Who said I'm upset, Lenny? This is all in your head.
I say you're upset because you've got dark circles under your eyes, that's why. I keep reminding you have difficulty sleeping. You've become a nervous wreck. I think the house is the source of the problem. I think unfortunate memories of your past are now jumping back into your mind, causing you grievous distress. And that makes a whole lot of sense to me. Imagine those Jewish people in concentration camps during the Second World War. If they went back to the site of all the atrocities they received from their oppressors, can you imagine the traumatic memories they would conjure up? And how much peace would be robbed from their lives? It's bad to go back to places that provoke unpleasant memories of the past, as they will only serve to unkindly remind you of what actually happened there. I frowned. What has a Jewish concentration camp got to do with Silver Lake's house? Absolutely nothing, Lenny. What I'm trying to say, sweetie, is if you have unhappy memories in this home, which you most certainly do, why would you want to live here? I don't need to listen to this, Lenny. You don't know what on earth you're talking about. Did you not hear what I told you 2 seconds ago? Or are you very conveniently turning deaf? I had some very happy memories that I spent in this house with my father. I felt close to him in this home, even though he's long gone. There were also good times I spent with my mother before I became a teenager, when Dad was still alive. Believe it or not, my mother back then was a nicer person. She only turned sour after Dad died. Don't make excuses for your mother. She was always obnoxious. Think about it, Lenny. It couldn't have been easy for her coming home that day, to find my poor father lying dead on the kitchen floor, in a crumpled heap, with his face so puffy she barely recognized him. She knew then what had happened. My dad had an acute allergic reaction to peanuts and was unable to call for help, as it came on so fast. And for some reason his EpiPen failed to work. I think my mother never forgave herself when she discovered the cereal he'd had for breakfast that morning was contaminated with peanuts. It was a very horrible way to die, my husband agreed. But your mother got a lot of compensation from the cereal company, did she not? I know, but that's only money, Lenny. She lost my father. He meant the world to her. She was never the same after he died. She became very aggrieved towards me. I suppose I can't blame her in the circumstances. It was when I was a teenager that I found I could do nothing right as far as she was concerned. She loved nothing better than putting her claws into me. She blamed me inadvertently for my father's death. You see, I was the one that wanted that box of cereal. I'd been to a friend's house, so I said, "Mummy, please will you buy the cereal because it's so yummy. I had it at Sophie's house." And she said to me, "No, you're not going to have this cereal. There's far too much sugar in it and it's unhealthy." And I said to her, "Please, Mummy, please, just as a treat." Well, she put her foot down, but I begged her to buy it, and eventually she relented. And I have to say, she put the cereal in the trolley and bought it. My dad had some of the cereal for breakfast one morning, not knowing that it contained trace peanuts. Not the cereal itself, if you know what I mean, but the factory where it was made contained peanuts. She would blame me for his death. "You were the one that wanted the cereal. Look what you've done. You've killed your father. This is all your fault. I shall never forgive you for this." So after the cereal incident, nothing was ever the same in our home. She began to pick fault with me. "Your mother was completely unreasonable," said Lenny. "She didn't have to buy the cereal, did she? She should have checked the warning on the package that said that the cereal was made in a factory where there were peanuts. At the very least, she should have warned your father not to eat that packet of cereal. But she did nothing of the kind. As far as I'm concerned, she was the one at fault. She was irresponsible. You were only a child. How could she possibly blame you for what happened?" Well, she did. And in a manner of speaking, I blamed myself as well, because I realized, had it not been for me, that my father would not have died. This was not your fault, sweetheart. You need to get that thought out of your head. You see what I mean by unpleasant memories going around in your head? If you've changed your mind about living here at Silver Lakes, I would quite understand, love. If you need to put this place on the market, sell up and move away, I would be the first to encourage you to do that. I think Silver Lakes is stirring up memories from your past. That's why you look so out of sorts at the moment. And I think moving away might fix up the problem for you. We want to get a skip back into your step, colour into your cheeks. We could move back to Nova Scotia if you like. My boss did say I could always pick up where I left off if we were to return." "We're not going back to Nova Scotia, Lenny. We're staying here," I said, brushing past him. "Where are you going, love?" "I'm going downstairs. I've got to fix the quiche for dinner tonight." My husband stood on the landing. He shook his head solemnly as he watched me as I sashayed down the staircase, past Eartha, who was still preening herself on one of the steps. She looked up at me nonchalantly through green eyes, gave a muted meow, and continued with her regime of cleaning herself. Claps of thunder continued to rudely crash against the house, as if something was beating my mother's house with a sledgehammer, as if the storm itself was having a formidable temper tantrum. All I could think about was the figure I'd seen staring up at my window moments before. Someone was hell-bent on harassing me. They wanted me to see them, so that they could scare me half to death, and let me know that they were stalking me. I was determined I would not let that individual, whoever they were, drive me away from my mother's home. That was never ever going to happen. Silver Lakes was my home now, and it was my husband's home. I had put my signature and stamp on the place. What my husband Lenny failed to realise was that Silver Lakes meant the world to me, and it had meant the world to my late father, so getting rid of the house was inconceivable to me. I knew, of course, that Lenny was absolutely right. I wasn't the same chilled person that I had been before I moved into Silver Lakes. But moving here was not the source of my current distress. It was true that despite transforming Silver Lakes and throwing away all my mother's clutter that she had hoarded over the years, I could feel my mother's oppressive energy hanging around the house, even though she was long since dead. It would seem her unpleasant presence was like a lingering smell you cannot wash out of the curtains, like stale cigarette smoke. I had heard of haunted houses before, where it is said the indelible memories of all the previous owners are left behind in that house. I had pooh-poohed such ideas, until I moved into my childhood home, of course, and I realised that this house was more than just a structure made from bricks and mortar. It was like a photograph album, containing within its walls snapshots from the past. Sometimes I would get flashbacks of my mother haunting me in the daylight hours at Silver Lakes, like a real ghost, even though she was long since dead, but it felt as if she was still around. In my mind's eye I could vividly see her wide eyes, glaring at me contemptuously, as she told me that I looked like a tart when I was spending time with girlfriends on an evening. "Have you got no shame, girl?" she would say. "That skirt of yours is far too short. It barely covers your knees. If your father were to see you now, he would be appalled. Why can't you have the grace to cover yourself up? Have some dignity, girl. You're an embarrassment and a disgrace. Go to your room at once and get those filthy things off you at once." "Please, Mum, don't be like this. This is a really cool skirt. I bought it with my pocket money. I really want to wear it this evening." "I'm your mother. I will not allow you to leave this house under any circumstances looking like a hooker that's standing on a street corner, touting for business. What kind of a mother would I be if I allowed you to dress like a hussy?" I remember the disgusted, revulsed way my mother had looked at me that evening, with a fierce disapproval. But my arrogant mother was the kind of person who believed every body part should be modestly covered up, and nothing should ever be on display. That is, if you had any self-respect at all. And after my dad's death, she had become very austere with her stringent rules. "But, Mum, don't you understand? This is the fashion at the moment. Everybody's wearing short skirts like this," I had said, to no avail, of course. "I don't care what everybody else is doing, or what everybody else you say is wearing. I care what you're doing, Olivia, and the way you dress is sending out the wrong messages to men. That skirt makes you look decidedly cheap. You should have a good, long, hard look at yourself in the mirror, dear. You don't look at all good." "Mum, the skirt isn't that short," I protested. Some of the girls wear them so short that when they bend down you can actually see their knickers. I don't do that. My skirt is dignified, Mum. It's above my knees. What's wrong with that? Do not answer me back, Olivia. I am your mother. You don't cross-examine me. It's the other way round. What I say always goes. Do you want to go to the party or not? My mother snapped at me furiously. Of course I want to go, Mum, I had said, tears spilling down my cheeks. Stop snivelling like a real baby. Grow a pair, will you? I didn't bring you up to be a blubbering wreck. And for goodness sake, crying over a skirt. I've never seen anything more ridiculous in my entire life. You will do as I say, Olivia, and I will find you something decent to wear in your wardrobe, because clearly you have no clue what to dress in. That flimsy skirt of yours needs to be trashed. No daughter of mine is going to be seen dead wearing such trash. My mother brought out a long frock from my cupboard that she'd made for me herself, that I'd never ever worn because it was so frumpy. Mum, I can't possibly wear that. It's ugly, it's horrible, and it's so big. It'll make me look like a tent. It'll make you look very attractive, love. It will accentuate your virtue, which is in very short supply at the moment, it would seem. It's got a decent hemline above the ankles, which is far more flattering than above the knees, I can assure you. And so much better than that god-awful skirt of yours. Where on earth you bought it, I cannot imagine. I had begrudgingly put on the horrible dress that reminded me of something the Amish would likely wear. It would need a bonnet to finish off the look. When I had seen my rather shabby reflection in the mirror, tears poured down my cheeks. I looked absolutely awful, but my mother smiled with a great satisfaction, especially when she saw the miserable look on my face. She seemed to thoroughly enjoy making me unhappy. What are you sniffling about, you ungrateful little brat? That dress looks perfectly lovely on you. Why are you complaining? I'm still going to let you go to the party, aren't I? But I can't go looking like this. I look like a freak. Nobody dresses like this. Well, I'm sorry to hear that. They obviously have got absolutely no taste and no self-respect whatsoever. But no daughter of mine is going out looking like a hussy, and that is final. I had watched in horror as my mother brought out her dressmaking scissors, and she cut up my short skirt into ribbons. I was lucky because my best friend Angie would surreptitiously give me some of her trendy clothes to change into when I arrived at the party, so that I didn't look like an ancient relic from the 18th century, which I was exceedingly grateful for thanks to her, because I did not want to be a freak at the parties I attended. So yes, you could say, I did have some less than agreeable memories of some less than pleasant times spent here at Silver Lakes with my mother. But what my husband Lenny failed to fully appreciate was that my current distress was caused by someone who was stalking me, and had absolutely nothing to do with my late mother. Lenny was the kind of man that did not suffer fools gladly. If he had an inkling of what was actually going on with me, he'd have probably gone after the stalker himself, with all guns blazing, and wouldn't have been adverse to beating them up into a pulp to get them to leave me the hell alone, as Lenny would do absolutely anything for me, even if it meant breaking the law. I couldn't let Lenny get involved in my current dilemma, or take the law into his own hands, so the less he knew about what was currently going on with me, the better as far as I was concerned. And there were some secrets from my past he had no knowledge about at all, and I wanted to leave it that way. He was right, of course. I was indeed an emotional mess. I was losing a great deal of sleep at night, and living on my nerves. I knew someone was following me around, but I had no way of knowing who it was. But I intended to find out at the first opportunity. I wanted to confront that person myself. I knew whoever they were, their primary focus was on me. They wanted me to see them. It was like they were feeding off my fear, delighting in my discomfort that they were projecting towards me, along with the nasty notes they kept sending me in the postbox. I wondered if the stalker was trying to intimidate me, to get me to leave Silver Lakes, which was a distinct possibility. My mother had known a lot of people in this neighbourhood over the years, and when I left home she had only spat out vindictive spite against me, creating scandalous rumours about her own daughter that had spread around the neighbourhood like wildfire. My mother genuinely believed that I had the morals of an alley cat, and furthermore she wanted everybody else to know about it. I knew coming back here might have ruffled a few feathers among some of the long-time residents, who seemed to have memories equally as long. Many of these people that had lived here when my mother was alive had held her in high regard, not having any notion that behind the sweet charming veneer that she projected to the world lurked a very nasty woman indeed, who was probably spouting out venom against them behind their backs, without them being even aware of it. My mother could be syrupy sweet to anybody she met. People would not think she was capable of being nasty. But growing up I'd heard my mother's catty ramblings about people in our neighbourhood that were less than kind. It was not uncommon for me to hear her bad-mouthing someone based on what they were wearing. My mother always judged people by their outer appearance, and if they wore anything she felt was too revealing, she'd always call them a harlot. I knew that because I had been called that name often enough, and it had never sat well with me. I had not been back to my childhood neighbourhood in many years. Much had changed, as it always does when you've been away from a place for a very long time. The most noticeable change for me, of course, was the trees that fringed our pavement, that over the years had grown into spectacular, towering and mighty specimens that were nothing short of impressive, and these trees fully shaded the street. Many of the attractive houses had been renovated. People seemed to take pride in the presentation of their front yards, more than ever before, with neat flower beds, pristine hedges, and neatly manicured lawns. The neighbourhood was situated outside Spokane, Washington, and had a rural energy about it, boasting wood groves of trees and all kinds of intrepid trails for horses and mountain bikes alike. So if you were an adventure seeker who enjoyed embracing the great outdoors, it was pretty close to a perfect place to live, as you can get. Mrs. Passmore, who lived next door to us when I was a little girl, had made her feelings about me very clear when I returned back to my old childhood home. She was one person I would have happily avoided like the plague, but I knew a confrontation with her would be inevitable. That woman had a mouth on her that would make a dirty potty look clean. Suffice to say I was heartily relieved that Mrs. Passmore's husband and son were no longer around, as they had been tragically killed in a car accident 5 years prior. I don't know if I would have returned to my home if that had not been the case. I hate to say this, but I had no empathy for their plight, based on what they had done to me all those years ago, when I was a teenager. I tried not to think of that inauspicious event that had so wantonly destroyed my life and robbed me of my reputation, which my mother had been hell-bent on destroying for me. She never had believed my account of what had happened that night, especially when I returned home, wearing clothes my mother thought were suitable for only a prostitute to wear. On that evening I'd been wearing a sparkling silver skirt that Angie had lent me, with its hem above the knees, and a black turtleneck sweater with a silver belt. In my haste to get away from the Passmore household as fast as I could, I had not changed back into my mother's homemade dress that I had stuffed into my bag and overlooked. In my desperate haste to escape the likes of Kev Passmore, who was about my age, along with his creepy father, I had rushed home wanting sympathy from my mother, but that was in short supply, practically non-existent, for none came my way. I had so longed for her to take me lovingly into her arms, and to tell me all was going to be all right, but instead she greeted me with contemptuous, dagger-like eyes, filled with such hatred that were as sharp as thorns and as spiky as needles. "What the hell happened to you tonight?" she asked me, her eyes studying the clothes I was wearing in abject horror. "Where is that decent dress I gave you to wear this evening? Why are you not wearing it? Where did you get that silver skirt from? You look dreadful. You look like a tart." "The dress is in my bag. I changed into this skirt that Angie lent me. You borrowed clothes from Angie. Is that what you did? You were supposed to wear that dress I made for you. Why are you snivelling like a great big baby? What the hell is wrong with you tonight? Mum, I need to talk to you. Something really bad happened to me tonight. Really bad. I have to tell you what Kev Passmore did to me. Tears pooled down my cheeks as I began to sob, but my mother had no pity on me. If you've had any trouble from Kev Passmore, love, you brought this on your own self, said my mother. I warned you not to dress like a tart. If you dress like a hussy, you'll be treated like one. Look at you in that silver skirt. You look ridiculous, like something that should be hanging on a Christmas tree. I raised you to have self-respect, but you're letting it all hang out. You're an embarrassment to me, you really are. If Kev Passmore has paid you attention this evening, I can't say I'm remotely surprised. You brought this on yourself. Honestly, I raised you better than this, Olivia. Now off to bed at once. We'll talk about this matter in the morning, because right now I can't bear the sight of you. If you pull any more stunts like this, borrowing your friend's clothes again, you shan't be attending any more parties. I can assure you of that. Mum! Kev Passmore hurt me tonight. Mum! I blubbered. He attacked me. My mother rolled her eyes in the back of her head. For goodness sake, Olivia, go to bed, will you? As I told you, I cannot bear the sight of you. If Kev Passmore was paying you attention tonight, I keep telling you, you brought this on yourself. I told you to wear sensible, respectable clothes, but you wouldn't listen. So don't expect any sympathy from me. In the end, I knew there was no arguing with my mother. I soberly soaked in a hot bath, scrubbing myself so incredibly hard that I'm surprised I had any skin left on me at all when I finally did get out of the bath, when it was ice cold. My whole body was now stinging, burning from the pain. I wanted to get any trace of Kev Passmore off my body, but I had no way of knowing that shaking that young man off my life would not be so easy, as even all these years later he still haunted my nightmares like the Grim Reaper, even though he was now dead. I could still see his bloated red face as he forcefully pinned me down to the carpet in his parents' living room. His breath smelt strongly of alcohol. "Let me go, Kev!" I had cried. "Please stop this, Kev! Don't do this! Please, I'm begging you!" But a deep guttural voice from the back of Kev's throat had emerged. His eyes had grown dark and hostile. It was so icy cold, the look he gave me. It would seem that Kev Passmore, who had always been a good friend of mine, had just dissipated, and I was staring into the eyes of a monster I did not know. So here I was back at home 17 years later, with some less than savoury memories that still clung to me like the threads of silk from a spider web. I suspected Mrs. Passmore had seen the removal van parked outside my mother's old house. She had obviously grown curious. She had marched over to me indignantly, like a hornet that would like to get its thorny barbs into me. The indignant look on her face withheld any friendly overtures towards me. Mrs. Passmore had grown a lot older in the 17 years I'd been away from Silver Lakes, but I suppose that was to be expected, as age doesn't do us any favours, and 17 years can be a considerable long period of time. I had been renovating Silver Lakes over the last 6 months, and had fortunately not crossed paths with Mrs. Passmore, although I had noticed her curtains tweaking from her house, so I guess she'd been watching me for all this time. It was now that she had chosen to show herself to me, and this was not a reunion that I welcomed. I noticed her hair was no longer auburn, but was now as white as a lily. She was wearing it in a rather fetching short-cropped hairstyle that suited her small face and long, heavily wrinkled neck. Her indignant brown eyes glared at me furiously through the crinkled folds of flesh. Her face reminded me of a tortoise, as her eyes took up most of her face, that had shrivelled up and become rather small. She was wearing a modest pair of navy blue chinos, a stylish gold belt, and a crisp white cotton shirt, with a sensible matching pair of white pumps on her feet, although she was thinner than I'd remembered her. But my mother had always said that she ate like a bird. "That woman is a walking skeleton. She's always watching her weight. No flesh on her bones whatsoever. She looks dreadful, you know. She thinks she looks so attractive, when the reverse is actually true." As Mrs. Passmore made her formidable approach towards me, my heart began to flutter in my chest. I drew in a deep breath. I felt as if I was bracing myself for the impact of her cruel words, which I knew would never ever be kind. If looks could kill, she was wearing that look on her face, which I read as saying, "What the hell are you doing here?" "Look what came crawling through the woodwork," said Mrs. Passmore sarcastically. She gave me a furious look. "Fancy seeing you here, Olivia, after all these long years." "How long has it been?" she said. I think it's about 17 years, if I'm not mistaken. I can't say I'm surprised you're back again, like a big fat maggot crawling over a dead, decaying carcass. I knew once your mother was gone, you'd be back like an odiously bad smell that can never abate. Couldn't help yourself, could you, dear? I've seen you crawling over her house, Silver Lakes, within weeks of her death, as you were renovating it, weren't you? It's disgusting, that's what it is." I ignored Mrs. Passmore's brutal jabs. I knew that woman would never be nice to me. She had always despised me, probably because under the layers of her denial, she knew that her late son, Kev, when he was alive, had been a monster. But being his mother, she didn't have the guts to admit the truth to herself, as living in denial was so much easier. I gave her a watery, insincere smile. "How are you doing, Mrs. Passmore? It's been a long time." "Not long enough as far as I'm concerned," said Mrs. Passmore. "I was hoping that I'd never get to lay eyes on you again, Olivia. You brought so much shame on your poor mother." I said nothing, as Mrs. Passmore turned around to look at the activity around the removal van, and could see my husband talking to one of the men in earnest. "Is this what I think it is?" she said, looking at the removal men, hauling in some furniture from our previous address, and calling out to me, "Ma'am, do you want this couch in your living room?" "Yes, please," I said. "Could you put it under the bay window overlooking the street? It'll be very nice in there." "Will do so, ma'am," said the man, throwing me a warm smile. I watched the two men hauling up the heavy white leather couch up the steps, huffing and puffing as they did so, and they heaved it through the arched entranceway. It was quite a mission. I reluctantly returned my polite attention back to Mrs. Passmore, who was still standing next to me, with an unamused scowl developing on her face. There was no doubt that she was not best pleased to see me again, especially because I was moving in next door to her. She'd probably thought I was renovating the place to sell up, but not to move in. I didn't care what she thought about it. I'd put the past behind me, and she would do well to do very much the same. I was not going to let the ghosts of the past haunt me again, especially since some of them were now dead. This was my late father's home, and I wanted to keep it in the family and pass it on one day to my own child. Kev Passmore and his father were long since dead. I need no longer live with the fear that those two men had inflicted on my life such a long time ago. Those old bruises had long since faded. "Sorry," I said. "What were you saying, Mrs. Passmore? I got distracted by the removal men. I've got so much on my mind at the moment with the movers here, as you can see. It's been busy sorting this place out. But we're getting there slowly and surely. I'm sure you can see the house has had a full makeover. I've thrown away all my mother's clutter. There was so much stuff." Mrs. Passmore frowned. "You should be ashamed of yourself, Olivia. I can't believe you're talking like this. What kind of a daughter are you? You never visited your mother once when she was dying of cancer. I can't say I'm remotely surprised by your attitude. Your poor mother spent her last days in Silver Lakes all on her own, you know. I made sure I visited her every single day. She really appreciated my visits. She was in a lot of pain, you know, so they administered her lots of morphine. Your mother refused to go to a hospital. She wanted to die at Silver Lakes on her own. She had 2 hospice nurses who took care of her full time. She told me she wrote to you, Olivia, but you never came to see her, did you? She wasn't surprised about that. She always said you were rotten to the very core. But now she's gone, you're crawling over everything she owned, aren't you? Like a big, fat, juicy maggot. You can't wait to get your greedy hands all over her assets, can you? It's so typical. Why on earth she left you her house and her money, God only knows. I tried to persuade her to leave it to the dog shelter, but she just wouldn't listen. You didn't deserve a thing after you brought so much shame on her, in the way you did. She never got over it, you know. Mrs. Passmore, if you don't mind my saying, your words are like thorny barbs. You well know there was no love lost between me and my mother. That is no secret, especially after what happened that night at your house, which was not my fault. I will admit she wrote to me, asking for me to get in contact with her. I didn't know she had cancer at the time. Had I known, I'd have come to see her. Despite everything, she was still my mother. I didn't get in touch as I didn't see the point. My mother decided a long time ago that I was a whore. Nothing I was ever going to say would ever change her mind about that. Your mother thought you were a whore because you were a whore, Olivia, and you probably still are. A leopard doesn't change its spots, does it? Look at the way you dressed back then. You left nothing to the imagination. I'm just glad you're a little bit more modest now. Maybe you've learned some invaluable lessons. In those days, you left everything hanging out. All your girlfriends were much the same. It was shameful, as your mother said. She was desperately embarrassed by your behaviour. She had to get you to dress sensibly. Don't think she didn't know what you got up to when she wasn't looking. You'd leave her house wearing such a nice, sensible dress, and when you arrived at a party you would change into something really slutty and immodest. My son Kev told me all about it. Don't forget he saw you. He was at the parties you went to as well. Everybody dressed like that back then, Mrs. Passmore. It was the fashion, I'll have you know. My skirts were a lot longer than some of the other girls. I was a teenager, for goodness sake, trying to express myself and to fit in with my peers. Everyone dressed like that. So you should have called us all sluts in that case. I was more modest than most. If I'd worn the dress my mother insisted I wore, I'd have looked like a fish out of water at those parties. When you're a teenager, you want to fit in with your peers, don't you? It's normal behaviour. The dresses my mother made me wear made me look like a nun at a convent. Tell yourself that as much as you like, Olivia. But you wanted to dress trashy, didn't you? Don't forget on the night my husband saw you. He saw everything. He told me what he saw. You were all over my son. You couldn't get your filthy paws off my Kev. The 2 of you were inebriated. You drunk all of my husband's finest Scotch whisky, and then you set about getting your promiscuous claws into my poor son. You defiled my boy, Olivia. Kev was a good boy, a very good boy, until you got your slutty little claws into him. We had to send him to a school far away from here because of what you did and your licentious reputation. I couldn't have you taking advantage of my son again. When I told your mother what my husband had seen that night, your mother was absolutely mortified. She wasn't surprised, of course. She always knew you were a slag. When I told her how you threw yourself at my son Kev, her worst fears were confirmed about you. Was it any surprise your relationship with your mother fell apart? It combusted on its own. You brought this on yourself, Olivia, because of your wanton ways. I wonder if your husband knows what a hussy you were back then. If he did, he'd give you a wide berth, I'm most sure. No man wants to be married to a loose woman. Mrs. Passmore, your husband was lying. You know it, and I know it. Maybe he lied to protect your son. I'm sure that's what he did. He physically saw your son, Kev, raping me in the living room of your home, on that blue carpet in there. And he did nothing. He did nothing to stop it. I begged him to help me. I begged and begged. But he didn't do a thing. He just watched your son raping me. That was just the most awful thing. I was telling your son to stop. I didn't want him to touch me. We'd only ever been friends. I wasn't interested in him that way. We went to school together. He was a nice boy. But that night, he turned into a savage animal that I didn't recognize. It was like the devil came out of him that night. You can blame the drink as much as you like, Mrs. Passmore, but there was a dark side to Kev, and I think you know it. How dare you talk about Kev like that? My Kev was a good boy. You were the corrupt one. You came on to him, not the other way round. Mrs. Passmore, I said, raising a hand to silence her, when your son was finished with me, your husband tossed me out of your house as if I was a garbage bag, telling me to leave Kev alone, and that I was nothing more than a dirty slag. But your son, Mrs. Passmore, was the guilty party. What he did was wrong. He took advantage of me, Mrs. Passmore. I told him to stop. I said no, but he still wouldn't listen. You and my mother twisted everything to your own advantage. You wanted to believe the very worst about me, didn't you? You spread thick, ugly lies about me around this entire neighbourhood. And everybody believed your lies. It was disgusting what you did, Mrs. Passmore. But you did it to protect your son's reputation. You didn't want people to know what he was really like, did you? You didn't want them to know he had raped me. Lies, lies, lies. That's all that comes out of your mouth, Olivia, dear. I can see you haven't changed at all. You're still lying through your teeth. But then again, why change the habits of a lifetime? Said Mrs. Passmore, her eyes growing round with rage. You forget, Olivia. My husband saw it all with his own eyes. He told me everything. I'm not going to stand here arguing about this with you, Mrs. Passmore. What's the point? You've made up your mind that I'm a liar, and that's the way you want to play it, and that's fine by me. I've got better things to do with my time than argue with you about the past. I've moved here to make a fresh start, and that's what I intend to do in my father's home. I'm not selling this place because the house has been in my father's family for generations. I intend to keep it that way. So I'm sorry, Mrs. Passmore, but I'm not going anywhere. Mrs. Passmore thrust a bony finger in my chest, glaring at me angrily. Lies, lies, nothing but lies. No wonder your mother couldn't stand the sight of you, Olivia. You brought shame to her, and this neighbourhood as well. That's exactly what you did. It's a pity neither my son or husband are around to defend themselves against your cruel character assassinations. If they hadn't been tragically killed in that accident, they'd be standing up for themselves right now, I'm most sure. Did you know it is evil to speak ill of the dead? Look, Mrs. Passmore, I heard about the car accident that killed your husband and son. I'm sorry for your loss. We're going to be neighbours now, whether you like it or not. I've decided to move into my childhood home, so let's at least agree to be civil with each other. Put the past behind us, shall we? Why do you have to move in here? That's what I don't understand, said Mrs. Passmore, growling furiously. Why did you have to come back and bring back so many nasty memories with you? Do you know what you are, Olivia? You're a bad omen. Everything is jinxed when you're around. You jinxed my son Kev and my husband, and now you're about to jinx me. I can feel it in my old bones. I watched Mrs. Passmore briskly turning around, marching defiantly back to her house. She turned around briefly and shouted after me, "If you know what's good for you, girl, you'll get out of here and move back to Nova Scotia. Nobody wants you around here. You're like a stain on the landscape. Why don't you just go away and never ever come back again?" "Who are you talking to, love?" asked my husband Lenny, walking over to me and watching Mrs. Passmore trotting back to her property and closing her front door behind her. "Oh, that's the next-door neighbour, who was very good friends with my mother. She's not best pleased to see I've moved in next door to her, that's all." "I don't like the look of her. She looks like an old bat. I don't like the thought of her being our next-door neighbour. I think I'd rather live next door to a 10-ton viper." "Don't worry about her, Lenny. Her bark is worse than her bite, I assure you." On the evening of the storm, I'd promptly retired to bed, with my husband Lenny at my side, crisply enfolded in the cool cotton Egyptian sheets. I was haunted by the thoughts of the ambiguous figure I'd seen in the afternoon, that had been staring up at me in my bedroom while it bucketed down with rain. Luckily, by this time the storm had long since abated. I lay restlessly in my bed, with insomnia being handed to me as the long, insufferable, drawn-out entertainment for the evening. Sleep had chosen to abandon me tonight. It would seem an unrepressed, spirited, nervous energy within me was gaining full control of my mind and building up like the water in a pressure cooker that reaches boiling point. As a consequence, I was almost having heart palpitations and hot flushes, like someone going through the menopause. This had to stop. I couldn't go on living like this any more. I needed to nip this in the bud at once. If I continued to live with fear leaching out the joy from my bones, then there was no point in living here at Silver Lakes. We might as well just move away and go straight back to Nova Scotia and be done with my childhood home. Maybe Mrs. Passmore was right. What was I thinking coming back here after all these years? It was probably a bad idea. All I was doing was dredging up some less than favourable memories from my past. I reluctantly climbed out of bed and trotted over to my window. I pulled back the curtain very cautiously and inwardly squirmed. I could see the figure again, standing there like a dusky silhouette against an inky sky. They were hell-bent on not leaving me alone. I knew in that moment, whoever they were, they hadn't noticed me staring outside the window. They were momentarily distracted and appeared to be speaking to someone on a cell phone at this late hour of the night. There was something about this person's movements that made me believe they were reasonably young. For a moment it had crossed my mind that Mrs. Passmore had been trying to scare me away from my home by stalking me. I wouldn't put anything past that manipulative, cunning woman. This solitary figure was too big to be Mrs. Passmore. This was my quintessential moment to get to the bottom of this enigmatic mystery. I needed to strike while the iron was hot. I had to find out who was stalking me. This time the stalker would be stalked. It was about time they had a taste of their own medicine. I would do everything in my power to ensure they had no knowledge I was on to them. Tonight I was going to get my answers, even if it killed me. My determination was resolute, my conviction unshakable. I tried to be as quiet as I possibly could. I discreetly got dressed, putting on a pair of black leggings, a hoodie, and a pair of sneakers. I made sure that my clothes were easily camouflaged, so hopefully I could blend into the darkness and become one with the shadows. I certainly could not afford to be seen by my stalker and blow my own cover. There was a night light on in the landing, and its soft gossamer glow enabled me to slip down the staircase as quietly as I could. The old staircase creaked and groaned a little under my footsteps. I was desperately afraid of waking Lenny up. At the best of times he could be a light sleeper. I trailed cautiously down the staircase. A claw grabbed my leggings, taking me off guard. I nearly let out an ear-piercing scream. It was Eartha making a play for my leg. That cat certainly picked an inopportune moment to decide when to play with me. She was always hanging around the staircase. I slipped past my cat, knowing that playing with her was the last thing on my mind right now, as any delay might well sabotage my chances of success in stalking my stalker. I found the kitchen door key and I gingerly slipped it into the lock. The door squeaked open. I was met by some abrupt, cool gusts of breeze as I slipped clandestinely into the night with the stealth of a burglar. I'd never enjoyed wandering around in the dark before. Even as a kid, I'd been terribly afraid of the long, lonely night hours that invited haunted imagery to always engage my nightmares that were vivid as a child. On this night, my fears were contained outside of my body, like the bugs in a glass jar. I could not afford to give them my attention, or I would never have the courage to venture out on my own like this. I really needed to do this. I cautiously scrambled over the damp, manicured grass that felt like a wet, dewy carpet beneath my feet. I noticed my stalker glance up at my bedroom window one more time, as if hoping to catch sight of me. The stalker appeared to have given up for the evening, and was clearly deciding to make tracks from whence they'd come. What they failed to realize was that I was following furtively behind them. There were a few street lights dappling the street in a faint, very useful illumination, which meant walking down the street was pretty straightforward. But I hugged all the dark shadows and used the tall, lofty trees on the pavement to cover up my pathway. I could hear the sound of an owl hooting in the darkness, intermingled with the cheerful chorus of the frogs and crickets. There was a couple of raccoons who had toppled over a bin somewhere, and the noise of the bin hitting the ground so forcefully had made them scamper away. I also had nearly jumped out of my skin with fright. At the noisy interference, my stalker promptly turned around, and with their flashlight had lit up the two frightened raccoons, who bolted away hurriedly, not appreciating being caught up in the glare of someone's spotlight. I heard my stalker chuckle to themselves, as if he or she was rather amused by the sight of the raccoons, while my heart was now beating thunderously hard inside of my chest. I was so terribly afraid of being seen by my stalker. Everything was steeped in an uncongenial, tenebrific darkness. The sky was like black tea, the houses devoid of all light, as if everyone had long since retired to bed. The time on my watch was 1:45 in the morning. I stealthily continued to follow after the black figure, who from time to time would occasionally stop, look back over their shoulders to check that they were not being followed. For a moment I was afraid they could sense my presence, but they continued to nonchalantly amble down the street, their dark clothes blending into the darkness so perfectly that sometimes I would almost lose sight of them for a moment. I had made it down the street without being seen, but I couldn't afford to let my cover be blown under any circumstances. I held a torch in my hand, but I couldn't use it at this moment. Ostensibly right now, I had recruited the darkness as my friend, so that I could hide within her cunning folds. When the figure reached the end of the street, they took the right-hand bend that veered off the road towards a footpath on the side of the purple house that belonged to old Mrs. von Gennen, who loved the colour purple. The path unfortunately led straight through the wood grove. My heart sank. I did not want to go through the woods at this time of night, to follow some obscure figure, but if I didn't, I might not find out who it was that was stalking me. I really needed to know the answer to that question, so I could not employ any bashful reticence or reservation. I realized the figure had taken a shortcut through the woods to get to our street, which meant the stalker probably lived on the other side of the wood grove, in another neighbourhood bordering the woods, of which there were a select few. I needed to find out who this stalker was, so I couldn't indulge the faint ramblings of my vacillating hesitancy to sabotage my success. I needed to do this. I summoned up all the courage I could, and trailed after the figure in the woods. The light of my stalker's torch lit up the way, as the moonlight spilling through the densely shaded trees was very minimal. I needed to enjoy the benefits of my stalker's torch, so I had to remain close behind them. I couldn't use my own torch, for if I did, I would draw immediate attention to myself. I am not sure what propelled me forward to walk under the canopy of the tall, lofty trees. I felt like a puppet on a string, as if a puppeteer was calling all the shots for me, directing my every single move. I needed to be extremely careful in the woods, very careful indeed, because if I so much as trampled on a twig that snapped under my feet, my stalker might realize I was there, and the crackling sound of leaf litter being trampled would get their attention. On many occasions my stalkers stopped and listened intently, as if they sensed somebody was trailing behind them. At one point I heard a young girl's voice saying, "Is anybody there? Is anybody there?" But the voice was met by an ominous silence. What the hell, I thought. My stalker was a woman, and a young one at that. The voice sounded like that of a teenager. I felt a little more self-assured, knowing that my stalker wasn't a man. I surreptitiously continued to follow the shadowy figure through the woods, until the woods ended by the intrusion of a long, windy asphalt road. I noticed opposite the sprawling grove of trees on the other side of the road were several houses, clustered together side by side. My stalker ambled over to a house directly opposite the wood grove, with a sign on the outside which read "The Groves." The figure in the hoodie pulled off the hoodie, shook out a tumble of long blonde hair, and cautiously made their way into a house, slipping in through the front door very quietly, and looking out towards the woods. I could only hope she, whoever she was, had not seen me, or sensed my presence. I watched the young lady closing the door behind her, and a light going on in the entrance hall. I had hit pay dirt. I knew where my stalker lived, and I knew she was a young teenager. I felt victorious, as if a huge weight was being lifted off my shoulders. I would now begin my own spying on the young lady who had been stalking me. I needed to find out exactly who she was, and why she was pursuing me and sending me all these nasty notes in the post. I was going to have my answers very soon, and that thought brought me monumental relief. Alas, retracing my walk through the woods was rather daunting, and not very easy. This time I was not focused on the figure ahead of me that I had been following, so I became much more conscious and aware of the darkness that cocooned me on every side. And with every single rustle and every strange sound I heard, I became extremely skittish and on edge. In a trice, everything became deadly quiet in the woods. I was aware only of my breathing and the sound of my heart thundering in my ears. Someone was there. I was absolutely sure of it. I could feel eyes burning into the back of my neck. I needed to get out of here as fast as I possibly could. Something felt terribly wrong. I stepped up my speed, moving as quickly as I could through the trees. My fear dismantled my focus and abruptly put me into a frenzied, uncoordinated spin, so that I found myself being propelled rather aimlessly by hasty, ungainly movements which blindly obscured my focus. I failed to see an overhanging branch that obstructed my pathway. I went clumsily flying into that branch. My head was hit with a forceful thump that was almost as bad as if someone had hit me with a cast-iron fire poker to knock me out. I was thrown back onto my feet, and everything went black. I am not sure how long I'd been knocked out for. When I started to come around, I heard two faint female voices conversing together that I believed was part of a dream. Kagilato, makati, alikako, atacha, ikalakolo, mata, nikalaso. What were they saying? Their voices seemed so muted, so far away, distant, but the words were spoken in an incomprehensible language that I did not understand or even know. I could feel my body being touched. Someone was shaking me very gently, as if trying to rouse me from a deep slumber. My head was throbbing violently. The shaking persisted. Slowly but surely, I reluctantly opened my eyes. I tried to adjust to the burgeoning morning light that filtered through the trees. That was when I became very aware of my surroundings. I was lying on a forest floor, under the canopy of trees, and that was when I saw two very large figures standing over me, with expressions of concerned bewilderment dappling their dark eyes. This had to be a dream. This could not be real. In a trice, I recalled the events of the previous night, and how I had followed the stranger through the woods. I had been knocked out by that tree branch on the way back home, and everything had grown black. I could hear the pretty bird song in the woods, so I knew where I was. It sounded like the morning dawn chorus. I felt dizzy, disorientated, and very confused, a little like you do when you come around from an anaesthetic after you had an operation. I really was beginning to wonder if I might be hallucinating. I knew that what I was seeing could not be a trick of the light. 2 female Bigfoots were standing over me. One was holding my arm. The other was pushing me up into a sitting position so that my back rested against the trunk of a tree. These creatures were so intimidating, so Herculean in size, that you'd have expected me to be frightened out of my skull. But they spoke to me in soothing voices, stroked me gently with their hands, as if encouraging me to get up. Kitaki, mokolabi, akasi. I was so confused and so bemused that I stared incredulously at the 2 Bigfoots, as if I was seeing aliens from out of space. For I had never believed in a million months of Sundays that these cryptid creatures were actually real. Even in my foggy, rather blurred state, I knew that what I was beholding was real indeed. Both the Bigfoots were easily between 8 to 9 foot tall, possibly taller. I couldn't be sure. Their lanky, lean bodies were robust and powerful, heavily muscular, their breasts small, their hair a dark cinnamon shade. The female Bigfoot was dabbing my head wound with some crushed leaves that smelt of peppermints. I could taste blood in my mouth, and when I put fingers on my head wound, I could see fresh blood on my fingers. I must have taken quite a beating from that tree branch, I thought. I could feel a big bump in my fingers as I traced my hairline. I knew I'd run directly into that tree branch when terror had gripped my heart. Perhaps it was the Bigfoots, who were now nursing me very kindly, that I had been running from. I knew something had been watching me in the woods. The Bigfoot pointed to my head and said something to me in a language I had no way of understanding, but it was like the meaning of her words suddenly just filtered into my head. Kilatikwa, hampala, hila kolopasi. You had a nasty fall. You hit your head when you ran straight into a tree branch. I've been trying to wake you up for a long time, but you were out cold. You must get up. The female Bigfoot, with a comforting overlong arm and powerful hand with fingers the size of sausages, pulled me up gently to my feet. I felt dizzy and disorientated, as if my knees were beginning to fold beneath me, and there were shooting pains going off in my head. The Bigfoot held me up, guiding me down the earthen path, step by step, helping me to put weight on my feet, and encouraging me with her words. Both Bigfoots clapped enthusiastically when I made a little progress down the footpath, almost as if I was a toddler learning to walk for the very first time. Soon I managed to walk unaided, with the 2 female Bigfoots standing at my side, encouraging my laboured efforts all the way. The taller of the 2 female Bigfoots asked me if I was going to be all right. Kipaki, ikala. I looked up at her pyramid face and into her chocolate brown eyes, and in her eyes I saw only love and kindness. Kilaki kwasi, matala. You can stay with us if you want to, until you get better, she told me. I never said anything, but the Bigfoots must have heard my very thoughts that I was thinking, because I was thinking at that very moment that I needed to get back to Lenny, that he'd be worrying about me. The female Bigfoot nodded, as if she perfectly understood my thoughts. She said something to the other Bigfoot, who nodded at her and looked at me with warm eyes. The Bigfoots accompanied me to the edge of the woods, and then they nodded at me once I reached the path that led up the street. "Where the hell have you been?" asked Lenny when I walked into the house. He looked at me in abject horror when he saw the trail of blood on my head and the leaves in my hair, along with the dirt on my clothes. "What the hell happened to you, love? Are you all right? Your head is bleeding." "Oh, don't fuss, Lenny. I just walked into a tree branch, that's all. Hit my head. I took a bit of a tumble." Where were you? I woke up at 7 o'clock this morning and you were not in bed. I was worried sick about you. Turns out I was right. Look at you. You go off for a walk and then you go and do something like that to your head. That injury on your head does not look good. There's blood all over your face. And all this green stuff. I can't work out what that is.
What my husband failed to know was that I'd been gone for several hours, and I was not about to reveal that to him. The clock in the kitchen said it was 8:05. I must have been knocked out for quite some time in the woodgrove, but I chose not to share the sobering information with my husband, for he would have freaked out had he known what I'd really got up to during the night. The less he knew about it, the better. I just couldn't sleep, so I went for a walk in the woods very early this morning. There's a lovely footpath near the purple house at the bottom of the road that leads into the woods. I went there.
Why did you not tell me where you were going, love? You know I need to know where you are. I don't like to wake up and find the house completely empty. I mean, you could at least have left me a note, couldn't you?
I didn't want to wake you up, I lied. You were fast asleep. I thought I'd be back before you got up. Turns out I was wrong.
Turns out you had a nasty fall. I don't like the look of that blood all over your head. You look as if you've got quite a bump on your head. I don't understand how you managed to walk in a tree branch like that in the morning. Surely you saw the overhanging branch. I need to clean you up and see if we need to take you to the hospital to get some stitches. That bump on your head looks pretty nasty. And what on earth is that green stuff all over your face?
I remembered the Bigfoot had been rubbing leaves on my skin, but I said nothing. I've no idea. And you really are fussing, Lenny. For goodness sake, I'm going to be absolutely fine.
It seems to me, love, that you've become rather accident-prone of late. I worry about you, which I'm entitled to do as your husband.
Jamie's account. I knew I should not be stalking Olivia, whose married name was Fleming. I couldn't help myself, following her around all the time. I wanted to scare her half to death. She deserved to be frightened out of her wits for what she'd done to me all those years ago. I wanted to make her pay, and pay big time. I hoped every night when she went to bed her knees were trembling, and if she was always wondering if this was the night that I was out there watching her. I'd been stalking her on and off, so she could never be sure when I would make my appearance. I didn't want to be predictable. It would be good to keep the woman on her toes. I knew I wasn't very big, but I hoped with my black hoodie and with the extra large shoulder pads I'd sewn into the fabric that I would look menacing and intimidating. I was fortunate to be tall, so I'm sure Olivia would believe I was a man. I wanted her to know she was being stalked. I had sent her threatening, malicious notes through her letterbox addressed to her saying, "I'm always watching you. You can look out of your bedroom window, and I will be there watching you. I'm going to make you pay for what you did." And of course, I meant every word of it. I felt great satisfaction when I could see the fear in Olivia's eyes as she reluctantly pulled back the curtains from her bedroom window on the upper floor of her home, and she saw me staring up at her. It felt so good to cause her such angst, to rattle the woman. There was no doubt I succeeded in my endeavours. The woman looked freaked out. I could see the anguish in her eyes. I felt no pity for her in that regard. She deserved to suffer, and I hoped I was hurting her as she had hurt me. I had been following Olivia around all the time, when it suited me to do so. My anger towards her was like an insatiable wildfire that could not be contained or put out. People know when they're being watched, don't they? But the great thing was that Olivia did not know who was watching her. That was the whole point. It was freaking her out. I wanted to get her back for what she had treacherously done to me all those years ago, or more to the point, what she'd wanted to do to me, which was even worse than what she actually did. I knew what she was like. She was a wicked cow. I'd heard it all from her own mother, Prudence, who put me well into the picture. It had come as a shock to me when a woman by the name of Prudence Wallace had got in touch with me. The message she had sent me
had turned my blood to ice. You do not know me, Jamie, dear, but I've been watching you grow up for all these years, and you've grown up into a lovely teenager, I see. You do not live far from me. I made sure of that geographical convenience when you were adopted, so that I could observe you growing up from a distance. I'm your grandmother. I hate to tell you this, dear, but I'm dying of cancer, and I wish to see you before I depart this earth. If you doubt you're adopted, you can look for your birth certificate, and you will see that you very much are adopted. Your mother's name was Olivia Wallace, and it will be on your birth certificate. It is now Fleming, as my daughter is married. She's living in Nova Scotia, I believe. Olivia was my daughter. She gave birth to you when she was a teenager herself. I had no idea she was pregnant at the time, even though I should have guessed, given her weight gain. Your mother gave birth to you on the kitchen floor, would you believe, all those years ago. You were born a healthy 6 pounds 2 ounces. I haven't got long to live, dear, so I think it only fair if you know the truth that you are adopted. Please contact me.
When I read the alarming message, the kind of message that no teenager ever wants to receive, I thought someone psychotic was toying with me. I ignored the message. Yet despite everything, the dismaying message haunted my mind. I could think of little else. Supposing it was true, that just did not bear thinking about at all. I loved my parents, so the thought of being adopted was something I didn't want to even contemplate. I realized I'd never seen my birth certificate before. It was not something I'd considered examining until now. It would seem when someone tells you that you're adopted, then you know you need to find the evidence to prove that such an outrageous, inappropriate suggestion is absolutely wrong. There was no way I was adopted. I could not be. I wanted to prove it. The burning need to know the truth overcame me. I knew where my father punctiliously kept all our passports. We had a safe that we hid behind a large painting. He used his birth date as the combination number for the safe, as well as the number for his cell phone. I was absolutely certain that he'd keep all valuable documents in the safe. That would include marriage certificates, identification documents, and birth certificates. It seemed like the most obvious place to search for my birth certificate, but I was terribly afraid of what I would find, as deep down in the core of my being, I knew that my very worst fears would likely be confirmed. Growing up, I had been well aware that I didn't look remotely like both of my parents. My blonde hair was enigmatic to anybody who knew me, for both of my parents were dark, so it had never made sense to me that I didn't look like them. It was with trembling hands that I grudgingly opened the safe. My parents had gone off together to pick up some Chinese takeaways for dinner, while I remained at home, claiming I had some homework I needed to complete, when in truth I had another agenda on my mind. I knew my parents would be away for a mere 10 minutes or so. The family safe was discreetly hidden behind the oil painting of the blue irises, which was a very good copy of Van Gogh's work. I put the surprisingly heavy picture down on the floor. It balanced precariously against the wall. I diligently opened the safe, using my father's combination number. It worked. I found a few jewelry boxes scattered around the safe that belonged to my mother. Beneath the boxes I saw a collection of papers and passports, clustered together in a large plastic envelope. I pulled out the envelope and hastily sifted through the papers. One of them was my birth certificate. For a moment I could hardly breathe. I avoided looking at the birth certificate. My heart was doing twisted somersaults in my chest. I suddenly realized I really did not want to look at my birth certificate. I was terribly afraid of what I would read. Like some people are terrified of looking at the number on the scale that proves their worst fears have been confirmed, that they've put on weight after Christmas dinner. For a brief moment I was tempted to shove the paperwork back into the safe and pretend I had not received that creepy message from the old woman. But an invisible cord seemed to pull my eyes down onto the page, forcing me to read the contents on the paper. My name stood there loud and clear.
Lisa Jamie Wallace. And then I read the name of my mother, Olivia Wallace, and father was left blank. My guts inside my belly began to squirm. Those were not the names of my parents. I could see there were also adoption papers in the safe. My heart plummeted. I was definitely adopted. The old woman, Prudence Wallace, who had contacted me, was absolutely right. I could hear my parents' car now rolling up the drive. They were coming back. They were coming back. I couldn't examine the papers any more intently. But I didn't need to do so. I'd seen enough. I'd seen far too much. I hurriedly thrust everything together, putting it back into the safe as quickly as I could, before my parents entered the house, carrying the Chinese takeaways in their hands and calling after me. "Jamie, we're back! I've got your absolute favourite, love," said my mother enthusiastically. "Sweet and sour pork, chicken chow mein, prawn crackers, and chicken spring rolls." I could feel the anger bubble up inside me. "I'm not hungry," I said, going back to my bedroom and slamming the door furiously behind me. The two people I loved more than anything in the entire world had perfidiously betrayed my trust, and the last thing I wanted to do was to enjoy dinner with them. How could they adopt me and not tell me about it? I was now seeing my parents as being treacherously disloyal and duplicitous. I could hear my mother saying to my father, "What on earth is wrong with Jamie? She was perfectly all right when we left to get the takeaways, and now she's being quite grouchy and cranky. She's normally such an agreeable teenager. What on earth has got into her?" She could hear her father letting out a muted chuckle. "Teenagers, eh? It's those racing hormones flying all over the place. Leave her be. I'm sure she'll eat some of the leftovers later, when her appetite returns. When you're Jamie's age, your emotions do somersaults all the time. I know what I was like back then. I don't know how my parents ever put up with me." "You don't think someone at school has upset her, do you, love?" "Whatever it is, I'm sure she'll work it out. Give her some time." When I was in my bedroom, I contacted the woman I believed was my grandmother, Prudence Wallace, and arranged to meet her the following day after school. "I'm so very glad you called, dear. I was expecting you to. I'm sure you must have found your birth certificate, so you do know that you're adopted now. I'm looking forward to meeting you in person. I live very close to you, at Silver Lake's house. You can't miss it." Prudence Wallace was not kidding about that. I knew I could take a shortcut through the woods, and I could be at her house within 15 minutes. My grandmother lived so close to me. Maybe she had been keeping a watch over me all these years. But I needed to find out where I came from, and who my birth mother actually was, and why she'd actually given me up for adoption. I had so many questions whirling around in my head, which I needed answers for. My parents had noticed I had become ungraciously moody and rather belligerent of late, snapping at them at any given opportunity. But I was so furious with them for keeping me in the dark about being adopted. Everything I thought I knew about myself was a big fat lie. The following day, when the school bus dropped me off at the top of Greenway Street, with a knapsack over my back, I took a shortcut through the woods and followed the trail that completed itself on the edge of a large-looking purple house. I was now on 5th Street, where all the houses with their pristine front yards were a cluster of personalities, like a group of people hanging together from different generations. It would seem new, more recently built houses blended seamlessly with old Victorians and Queen Anne styles. It was rather an enchanting, eclectic mix. The street was beautiful, with the exception, of course, of my grandmother's house, that stood out like an ugly sore thumb, like a disfigured intrusive weed growing among the roses. Prudence Wallace told me her house was called Silver Lakes, which I thought was odd, as the house did not overlook any lake. But maybe the initial owners of the old property thought the name was pretty, and so it stuck. Or perhaps there really had been a lake in front of the house in the olden days. I couldn't be sure. My grandmother's run-down, neglected, slovenly-looking house was the messiest and most unkempt house in the entire street. It was in a right bedraggled and disordered state, with long grass growing up wildly against the front door, weeds burgeoning all over the place, ivy suffocating the flower beds and strangling a selection of old rose bushes. There was peeling paint on the walls and window panes that were rotting. I knew houses with this kind of illustrious history behind them should be well preserved and well maintained, but this place had been left to decay, like an old tooth and a pair of receding gums. I reluctantly walked across a stone path that was heavily overgrown to a scuffed, heavily scratched front door. I tapped on it very gently. I was clandestinely hoping that no one would answer the door, so that I could run straight back home. But I could hear a shuffle of light footsteps and a soft female voice calling out, "I'm coming! Be there in a sec!" I was greeted to a fresh-faced nurse in her early 30s. She was wearing a smart blue uniform and offered me a bright, sunny smile as she opened the door to me. "Oh, you must be Jamie. Prudence is expecting you. Don't be too stressed out by her appearance. I need to warn you about that. She's a very sick woman, you see. Come this way. Be careful you don't trip over any landmines. I need to warn you they're lying all over the floor, I'm afraid. Mrs. Wallace is quite the hoarder, so this place is a bit of an obstacle course." Mrs. Wallace's house smelt rather niffy. I tentatively walked over mountains of plastic bags, stacks of books and newspapers, an abundance of plastic bottles. How could anyone collect so much rubbish, I wondered? If this was what hoarding was like, I wanted absolutely no part of it. The nurse beckoned me up the creaking staircase, lined with a thin ribbon of threadbare carpet. I followed her up to the first room on the right. She tapped on the door. "Mrs. Wallace, Jamie's here to see you." "Come in, Jamie," came an old woman's croaky voice. Mrs. Wallace had been propped up against the puffed-up pillows of her bed, as if she was expecting me. I noticed her nightstand was covered in medicine bottles, and there was a tumbler of water by her side. Prudence Wallace's face was paper-thin, very pale. She looked like a fragile porcelain doll that had not had its face painted yet. One brief glance at her told me that Mrs. Wallace was very ill indeed. She had a throaty cough and was always breathless. Sometimes she sounded as if she had sand in the back of her throat as she struggled to speak. I could see she was thin like a matchstick, which made her face look more like a skull with sunken hollows. She had dark moons of bruised skin framing her eyes, and a thin sprinkling of white hair on top of her head, which barely covered the pink skull that peered beneath. Was this what dying looked like, I wondered? It certainly wasn't pretty. She frowned at me. "Don't be shy, Jamie, love. Come and sit next to your grandmother, will you?" She pointed to a chair covered with a colourful crocheted shawl on the side of her bed. "You can go now, nurse," she said very sharply. "I'd like to spend some private time with my granddaughter, if you don't mind. We have a lot of catching up to do, don't we, Jamie?" I nodded, and anxiously sat down on the chair, removing the crocheted shawl, as it smelt rather manky. I put my satchel down on the floor beside me, and sat there nervously, looking up at Mrs. Wallace. I suddenly felt like all I wanted to do was to get out of this house as fast as I could. But instead I remained stoically seated on the chair, my school shoes tapping nervously against the thick woolly rug splayed out on the floor. Mrs. Wallace gave me a smile. "Don't be nervous, love. I can see you're terribly nervous. I know it's scary looking at a dying woman. I'm sure it's not a very attractive sight, but I assure you I won't bite. I just needed to see you before I breathe my very last. I will be lucky if I last the week. Thank you for getting in touch with me. Did you know you were adopted?" "No, my parents never told me. I found my birth certificate in the safe. When I saw my mother's name was Olivia Wallace, I knew your message had to be true, which is why I came here. I was very upset about it all, as you can imagine." "I'm very sorry, love. It must have come as an awful shock. But I did want to see you, and I think you do deserve to know the truth, don't you? Doesn't everybody deserve to know the truth?" "My parents should have told me the truth. They should have told me I was adopted." "Don't be too hard on them, dear. Maybe in the circumstances they probably thought it was best you didn't know the truth. Your parents really wanted a baby. Your mother was infertile, I'm afraid. She tried all that IVF treatment with no success whatsoever. I remember at church there were intercessory prayers prayed for your mother to help her fall pregnant, but she never did. So when you came along, I suggested that they both adopted you. They believed you were a gift of God. Your mother was so happy to have you in her life. She was thrilled to bits. It was the best of both worlds for me, as I could watch you grow up from a close distance, knowing you were my grandchild. Although I gave your parents my word that I didn't want to be involved in your life, I thought that would interfere with everything. So I would watch you at church every Sunday with your parents. I knew putting you up for adoption had been a very good decision on my part, because your parents loved the bones of you. I'm sure you know that already, though. But what about my birth mother? Why did she not keep me? And where's my birth father? Why did they give me up for adoption? I don't understand. Ah, well, my dear, the less you know about your birth mother, the better. Let's just say that she was not a good woman by any manner of means. You can count your lucky stars she never raised you. Believe me, dear, you had a lucky escape from that one. At this my heart began to thunder violently in my chest. What do you mean? Your mother was 16 years old when she had you. She was your age. Can you believe that? She had the morals of an alley cat back in the day. Absolutely no self-respect. She threw herself at the young boys indiscriminately. You know the type, as promiscuous as a bunny rabbit. She dressed like a real skank as well. She knew she was very pretty, and she flaunted it. You look a lot like her, actually. I suppose I should have known she was pregnant. She kept wearing baggy sweatshirts and leggings to hide her deceit from me. I accused her of eating far too much pie. Can you believe that? I thought she was getting fat, when all the time she was pregnant. What a fool I was! It never occurred to me that she was pregnant. She hid that from me well, you see. I never suspected a single thing. One night I was woken up to this whimpering sound. It sounded like an animal in distress. The sound was coming from the kitchen. I couldn't work out what on earth it was. It gave me quite the start, it did. That was when I found my daughter in the kitchen, giving birth to you. I could see your head was halfway out of her. I had to deliver you myself with lots of towels and hot water bottles, stuff like that. My daughter was crying. She didn't want you. She wanted to throw you into the trash bin and dispose of you. Pretend you never existed. But I would have none of it. I insisted my daughter went to hospital for her recovery, and that you were put up for adoption. And finally she agreed to follow my lead. She wanted to wipe her hands of you, you know. She had absolutely no heart. I stared at my grandmother incredulously, through round eyes, wondering if I'd heard right. My mother wanted to dispose of me. Throw me in a dumpster. Is that what you're saying? I'm afraid so, love. I know it's not easy to hear, but my daughter was a cold, emotionless fish, and it's best you know the truth. She didn't want a baby. She wanted to party all the time. She was a very irresponsible girl. That's why I persuaded her to sign over the papers for your adoption to your parents. And she did so, thanks to me. As a result, you've had a good childhood. Things could have been so different for you, if I hadn't put it all right. I dread to think what your mother would have done with you had I not woken up that night. If it hadn't been for my intervention, she could have stuffed you in a plastic bag and thrown you in the trash. And none of us would be the wiser, would we? No, that can't be true. She wouldn't do that. She wouldn't do that. That can't be true. Don't get upset, my dear. I'm telling you the truth. My blood went cold as my grandmother said this to me. I detected a smug look of satisfaction on her face, as if she'd got some kind of macabre kick out of telling me this. I didn't like my grandmother one bit. She was probably a narcissist, like her daughter was, because her daughter wanted to dispose of me. How could her daughter have no compassion on a baby that was born to her, a baby that was her own child? I didn't know that human beings could be so acrimoniously malignant, but I knew at once that my grandmother was not a good person, and was probably as mean-spirited and malicious as her own daughter Olivia. "And what about my father? Who is he?" I asked. "Does he know about me?" "Your father is an unknown quantity, dear. He could be absolutely anyone. I told you my daughter was a little hussy back in the day." She gave me a gormless grin. "She went with so many boys. You could be anybody's child." I had heard enough. Why had I come here to visit this stupid, implacable old woman who claimed to be my grandmother? She was sick in the head. She had enjoyed telling me I'd never been wanted, that I was a grievous mistake that her daughter wanted to throw away and dispose of in a dumpster. Fancy telling that to someone. "Oh, by the way, you were never wanted." I needed to get away from here as fast as I could. My grandmother's raucous words cut through me, cut through bone, marrow, and sinew. My mother had never wanted me, and that really hurt. I'd heard enough. Up until this point in my life, I had never known what it felt like to be spurned. "I'm not going to listen to this," I said, blocking my ears. My grandmother grinned at me. "But I haven't finished, love. I haven't told you everything yet." I hurriedly bolted out of my grandmother's bedroom as fast as I could. I dashed down the stairs, 2 steps at a time. They creaked and groaned beneath my feet. I heard the old woman cackle with laughter, like a witch, almost as if she was having a joke at my expense. "Your mother never wanted you, Jamie," she bellowed. "She wanted to throw you in the dumpster. Hear that, Jamie? The dumpster! What kind of a mother would do that to her little girl?" I dashed down the staircase, eyes filling with tears. I couldn't get away fast enough. I nearly tripped over piles and piles of newspapers and magazines, blocking my path, as Mrs. Wallace's clutter appeared to be hemming me in on every side, so I felt like a trapped animal that was unable to escape. My heart pounded violently in my chest, my breathing quickened, and I nearly screamed when someone touched me gently on my back. "Go away! Leave me alone! Go away!" I cried. I turned around, expecting to see the old woman, or my grandmother if you like, having morphed into the devil, tapping me vindictively on the back with an old gnarled hand. But it was the kindly nurse that had stopped me. She looked very concerned about me. "Is everything all right? What on earth is going on? What was all that about? I thought I heard Mrs. Wallace shouting. She wasn't shouting at you, was she?" "I'm fine," I said, trying to wipe away the tears from my face, with very little success. The nurse frowned. She took in my dishevelled state, and my puffy red eyes. "Has Mrs. Wallace upset you?" she asked, shaking her head furiously. "I probably should have warned you, love. Mrs. Wallace is a very pugnacious woman, who has a vendetta against the world, it would seem. Ostensibly her daughter has refused to visit her in her sick condition. She's been going on and on about what an ungrateful brat her daughter is. Most of the nursing staff at our hospice refuse to take care of her, because she's so obnoxious. Take no notice of Mrs. Wallace. She's got a mouth on her that can run away with her. Even though she's dying, it hasn't turned her into a nice person, I'm afraid." I nodded. "She's supposed to be my grandmother, you know. This is the first time I've ever met her. And then she says all this mean stuff to me. Mean, hurtful things, cruel things." I wanted to tell the nurse exactly what Mrs. Wallace had told me, but I couldn't say a thing. My tongue was involuntarily stuck to the roof of my mouth. My heart had become heavy. I had never met such a hard-hearted woman in all my life. And if this is what my grandmother was like, no wonder her daughter, who was my mother, was equally as vindictive. Didn't they say the apple does not fall far from the tree? "She's a difficult woman, love. I had no reason to believe she'd be unkind to you. She told me that you were her long-lost granddaughter, that she was meeting for the very first time. So I thought that your presence might bring about a shift in her mood, turn her into a more pleasant human being. But it seems I was wrong about that. It must be upsetting to meet your grandmother in such miserable, unfavourable circumstances, and I blame myself for this. She's dying of cancer. She's the angriest patient I've ever taken care of to date. I think she blames God for her cancer. She's not embracing the dying process with any grace or dignity. She's not repentant about a single thing. You know, I've had patients before in my life that have been disagreeable, but Mrs. Wallace, well, she's the worst of the worst. She's probably only got days left to live, you know, but that woman's still got a nasty tongue on her. If she said anything mean to you, take no notice of it, love. She said some less than kind things to me, I can assure you of that. But I turn a blind eye to it. I remind myself that she's a dying woman. There's no point in being offended or affronted by any of her unkind words. I expect it's her way of lashing out at the world and letting off steam, I suppose. Now, why don't you come into the kitchen with me? We can have a nice chat together. I can give you a sweet glass of Coca-Cola. I'm sure it'll make you feel a lot better. It was very nice of you to come and visit your grandmother today. If I'd known she'd have treated you this badly, I'd have never let you see her. I'm really sorry about that. I need to go. I said, tears streaming down my cheeks. And before the nurse could persuade me to stay, I had bolted out of the house, hightailed it down the street, blinded by my tears. And when I reached the woods, I just ran and ran, until I just dropped to the ground underneath a tree with my satchel, and collapsed into a heap, where I continued to sob. When I could sob no more, as I had no tears left to cry, I reluctantly rose to my feet, leaving behind the tree where I had unleashed all my sorrow. I began to walk away, leaving my satchel spilled out on the forest floor. In my grief I'd forgotten all about it, and as I sashayed away, I was hit by a plethora of pebbles that began to shower me like a sandstorm of tiny stones. I stopped dead in my tracks, wondering what had happened. I turned around to survey my surroundings, and as I did so, my knapsack was hurtled towards me and landed square at my feet. That was when I saw a mischievous pyramid-shaped head peering at me from behind the trees, with brown, very bright eyes. I could see through the foliage a Herculean physique, overlong arms covered in long flowing dark hair. I heard a shrill whistle, followed by what I can only describe as a chuckle. I knew in that moment that I had seen a Bigfoot. I ran eagerly towards the creature, but it had disappeared into the woods. The Bigfoot had wanted me not to forget my knapsack, but it was so elusive, I don't think it wanted any kind of contact with me, and was long gone. I remembered asking myself if that had really happened, and thinking about the Bigfoot had a remarkable effect in easing my pain and washing away the grief I felt in my heart. I was soon to learn a week later that old Mrs. Prudence Wallace had died. I felt no empathy for her plight. She may have been my grandmother by blood, but she was an obnoxious woman. I was also to discover that Olivia, my birth mother, had not only renovated my grandmother's house, Silver Lakes, restoring it to its pristine condition, but she was now living there with her husband. I thought about what my grandmother Prudence had told me about my mother, that Olivia had wanted to throw me away in the trash, suffocate me in a plastic bag. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became, which was why I began to stalk my mother. She deserved to suffer, given what she had wanted to do to me all those years ago. I knew I had rattled my mother's cage, and it felt good to get my back on her. Much like my grandmother, she was a very bad woman. I was grateful I had been raised by such good parents, who had loved me unconditionally. If there was anything good about Prudence Wallace, at least she had seen fit to get me adopted by decent people. The old woman had been watching me grow up for all these years, and before she died she wanted to spill the beans on my mother. One thing was clear to me. She hated her daughter almost as much as I did. I would get my revenge on Olivia. I couldn't believe that she had wanted to reject her own offspring. What kind of a person did that make her? I could never do that to my own little girl. Olivia's account. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. I knew a young lady had been stalking me, a teenager. But why? I needed answers. I couldn't help wondering if Mrs. Passmore, my next-door neighbour, was giving the young teenager money to scare me half to death, so that I would become unhinged and be forced to sell up my childhood home, Silver Lakes. I had a horrible gut feeling that Mrs. Passmore was behind all of this. That woman hated me living next door to her. Perhaps I was a constant reminder of what her son Kev had done to me all those years ago. I knew Mrs. Passmore was no idiot. She knew what Kev was really like. And I suspected, behind the threads of her denial, she knew he'd raped me all those years back, but refused to believe it. No mother wants to believe the worst of their son, for it reflects badly on them as a parent. Mrs. Passmore wanted me gone from the street, so she was paying a teenager to threaten me by sending me nasty notes in the post and making it very clear that they were so obviously stalking me. I was certain that this was what was going on. I thought about the Bigfoots that had rescued me after I'd been knocked out by the tree branch the previous night. Everything seemed so surreal in the cold light of day, as I thought over the event, that for a brief second I wondered if I'd imagined it all. Maybe the nasty knock I had sustained on my head had caused me to hallucinate. It was almost easier to believe that that had been the case, a fabrication of my mind, but I knew it was not. I realized I had not thanked the female Bigfoots for their help, so I decided I would return to the grove, taking some snacks with me. I would leave them hanging on a branch in a plastic bag. I was hoping that the Bigfoots would find them and know they were from me. I bought a papaya, grapes, a bag of walnuts, some mixed dried fruit, a jar of peanut butter, some honey, some raisin and oat cookies, some salted kettle chips, beef jerky, banana bread, and apple turnovers. When it came to my stalker, I had done some digging around. I found the girl that lived at the Groves was the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Frieseland. Her name was Jamie. She was about 16 years old, and every Sunday the family attended the church on 8th Street. It would seem her parents were very religious. Now I knew what needed to be done, so I set my plan into motion. I knew that Jamie Frieseland liked to make her appearance outside my home at about 4:30 in the afternoon, as she had done so on several occasions. I would be waiting for her. I would pounce on her in the woods, as it was a private location, without any eavesdropping ears around. I would confront her about what she was doing to me, and get to the bottom of it. It was late afternoon when I told my husband that I was going for a walk in the woods. "Not again," he said, shaking his head grimly. "Look what happened to you this morning, love. You've still got a nasty bump on your head. You've had stitches, and the nurses at the hospital told you you've sustained quite a bump. They were surprised it didn't knock you out cold. I really don't think it's a good idea for you going wandering off like this on your own, in your current physical state. You need to take it easy, love. Relax. Give your head time to heal." "What I really need is some fresh air," I lied. "I want to go back into the woodgrove. I promise you I'm not going to bump my head again." "Very well," said my husband, "but don't you dare be long, or I'll come after you, and that's a promise. Make sure you don't go walking into any more branches. For God's sake, look where you're going this time, or something worse might happen to you. Imagine if I'm forced to take you back to the hospital 2 times in 24 hours. The nurses will smell a rat. They'll think I'm beating you up." "Never! Don't be ridiculous, Lenny. No one would ever believe that about you." It was a beautiful afternoon as I walked down the street. I could see a couple of kids in one of the properties chasing each other around in the yard, squealing in delight. Their childlike antics made me smile. I reflected on my own childhood, and how good the years were for me before I became a teenager. It had been so wonderful to be carefree, with no responsibilities, but when you're that age, you're clueless as to how good you have it. Was it any wonder Peter Pan wanted to stay young forever? I observed a gentleman walking down the street towards me. He was sporting jeans and a sweater which read, "It's a dog's life," which made me smile. He was walking two rambunctious mixed-breed dogs, who were both pulling forcefully on the lead, as if they couldn't walk fast enough. The man gave me a friendly nod and stopped for a moment to introduce himself to me. "Hello there. The name's Lance Pilgrim. I've heard you've recently moved to the Silver Lakes house. Welcome to the neighborhood. It's very nice to finally meet you."
"Thank you very much. It's very nice to meet you as well."
"And you are?" asked the man. "My name is Olivia." "I wanted to say, Olivia, congratulations in restoring your home. It looks absolutely superb. At one point it was quite tumble down."
"Thanks. Well, I've tried."
"You've done better than tried. You've done remarkably well. It needed some TLC, didn't it? The old woman that lived there before, I didn't know her personally, but let's just say she let the place go to seed. Rumour had it that she was quite the hoarder. I'm just glad you fixed the place up. It's always worth preserving old homes. They've got so much charm and character, don't you think?"
"Oh, yes. It was absolutely worth saving."
"Well, I better be going," he laughed. "My dogs don't like me idling around talking. You can see they're walking me, not the other way round."
"I can see that," I chuckled. I bid the man farewell, and before long I was standing on the trail beside the purple house. And there I was in the woods again. I was carrying the plastic bag of goodies in my hand, and I made my way down the rich earthen paths. The woodgrove was beguiling at this time of day, with soft whispers of late afternoon sunshine sprinkling their glittering light through the trees, so that it almost looked fairy tale-like. I soon found the tree where I'd been knocked out during the night, but the obtrusive branch had been broken off and tossed to one side. I suspected the female Bigfoots had done that on my behalf, so that the branch would never be a problem again, by rudely slamming into someone's head, and possibly even taking an eye out. I found a branch on the tree to hang the plastic bag, that I hoped the Bigfoots would retrieve. I was sure they would know it was from me. I found a good hiding place behind a curtain of shrubbery, as I waited for my stalker to make her appearance. There were no guarantees, of course, that Jamie Frieseman would come this way today, for she stalked me sporadically. On some afternoons I would see her figure hanging around outside our property from the upstairs window of my bedroom. But by the time I ran down the steps to the front door, she would always be gone. I would look up and down the street to the left and right, and I would not see her anywhere. I would sometimes feel I was going mad in my head, although at the time I was convinced my stalker was a man. Then at night time, while my husband was fast asleep, and I tossed and turned restlessly in my bed, thinking of the ominous notes I'd received in the post, saying things like, "I'm watching you, and I'll make you pay for what you did," I would surreptitiously tiptoe over to my bedroom window and stare outside through a crack in the curtain, and I would see Jamie Frieseman standing there, staring up at me, against the grim, rather gloomy, foreboding darkness of the night. I would often rush downstairs, try and confront her myself, but she was always gone, like a flash of light. If Mrs. Passmore was paying Jamie Frieseman to rattle me like this, the young teenager was doing a fabulous job, but it was going to end now. It was going to end today. I waited for a long while in the woodgrove rather impatiently, until my patience wore thin. I knew I needed to return home, thinking that this afternoon had been a waste of time. My stalker had decided not to come and harass me today. Maybe they'd be back tomorrow. I felt disappointment seep into my gut. I was eager to confront this teenager, to find out what the hell was going on with her. It would seem Jamie Frieseman was not coming after me, after all. All of a sudden I heard feet kicking the trail. I could hear footsteps, and a voice singing some hip-hop song that sounded rather trendy. I held my breath, my heart pounding violently in my chest. It was Jamie Frieseman. She was coming this way. This was a stroke of luck. This afternoon I'd finally get my answers. Jamie walked nonchalantly down the path,
dressed all in black, but her hoodie was down, so that her long blonde hair began to blow in the wind. "Hello, Jamie," I said, blocking her pathway. "How do you know my name?" she asked gingerly. "I know quite a lot about you, Jamie Frieseman. I've been doing a little investigation, you see, and I know that you live at the Groves. I know you're the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Frieseman, and that you attend church every Sunday, and that your parents are very religious. I know you've been stalking me, sending me very nasty notes in the post, threatening notes, written on pink cardboard in black Sharpie. Now I want to know exactly what is going on here. Has Mrs. Passmore put you up to this? Has she been paying you to stalk me, to get me to move? Is that what's going on here? She wants you to scare me, doesn't she?" "I don't know what you're talking about, and I don't know who you are. I'm not stalking you. Now will you leave me alone?" I blocked her pathway. I stood there with a very furious expression on my face. "You are going to talk to me, young lady. Do you understand?" I said in a stern voice, grabbing Jamie by the arm so that she couldn't walk off. "I wonder what the police would think if I reported you for stalking me and sending me those nasty notes in the post. I've collected them all, you know. I'm sure they'll have your fingerprints on them. And then there's your parents. What would they say if they knew you were doing this to me? I'm sure they wouldn't approve. Leave them out of this, will you? Mind your own business. Are you trying to threaten me or something?" "I'm not threatening anyone, Jamie, but I need to know why you are doing this to me. I know you are my stalker. I followed you last night. Do you remember when the bin fell over and the 2 little raccoons scuttled away? You actually laughed about that. I just need you to tell me. Did Mrs. Passmore put you up to this? I wouldn't be remotely surprised if she did. She hates me living next door to her. She's loathed me since I've been a teenager. I believe she's recruited you to scare me away from Silver Lakes so that I'll sell up the house and leave the area. Is that what's going on here? I need you to tell me the truth, Jamie. It's very, very important." Jamie's face paled. "I don't know any Mrs. Passmore. All right, I admit it. I've been stalking you, but you deserve it. I wanted you to pay for what you've done to me. I want you to suffer, and really suffer, because you're a horrible, horrible person." Tears spilled into Jamie's eyes. "I hate you. I really, really hate you." "Isn't that a bit extreme, Jamie? You don't even know me. Why would you hate a perfect stranger? What have I ever done to you?" "I know what you did all those years ago. Your mother told me everything. She told me what kind of a person you are. I know the truth, and I know that you're a nasty, nasty, nasty person." "You know my mother?" I asked. "I met her once," said Jamie stiffly. "She told me what you did. It's disgusting, really disgusting, and I hate you." She began to sob. "I really hate you. You wanted to throw me in the dumpster, leave me to die, suffocate me in a plastic bag. How could anybody be so evil? How could you hate me so much?" "What on earth are you talking about, Jamie? You're making no sense at all. For your information, I'd never willingly suffocate anything. I can't even kill a fly. So I don't know where this is coming from." "I'm your daughter. Don't you get it?" said Jamie. I let out a stilted laugh. "No, I don't think so. My daughter died weeks after she was born. I was informed by my mother. She was adopted, you see, and she died in her cot. You're not my daughter." "But I am your daughter. I've got the birth certificate to prove it. On the birth certificate, my name is Lisa Jamie Wallace, but my parents have called me Jamie. On the certificate, it says my mother is Olivia Wallace. You're Olivia Wallace, aren't you? But that can't possibly be right. My daughter died shortly after she was born. That's what my mother told me. Your mother got in touch with me when she was dying. She wanted me to know I was adopted and that she was my grandmother. I didn't believe her at first. I thought some batty old lady was messing around with me, until I discovered the birth certificates that my parents kept in the safe. My parents never told me I was adopted. I didn't have a clue about that. So I went to see your mother at her house. I went to Silver Lakes when she was dying. She said she discovered you giving birth to me in the kitchen. She said I was born before the EMTs arrived. She told me you wanted to toss me away in the garbage and be done with me. I mean, how could you? I was your girl. I don't understand, I said, looking at Jamie with a bemused look on my face. I thought you were dead. My mother told me you died shortly after you were adopted. I believed her. She told me you had stopped breathing in your cot. I was absolutely devastated when I thought you were dead. I had in mind to look you up one day, you see, when you were older, because I had never wanted to give you up for adoption. I'd wanted to keep you. I asked my mother if there was a grave I could go and visit, and she said your parents had simply scattered your ashes. My mother has been lying to you. She lied to you, and she lied to me. She was a very bitter old woman. I hid my pregnancy from her because I knew she would force me to have an abortion. I really wanted to keep you. When my mother discovered me giving birth to you in the kitchen, she was livid. You have no idea how furious she was. I was hoping to deliver you on my own, but the pain was so excruciating. My mother woke up. She heard me. She called me a hussy and a trollop. She told me I brought shame on the Wallace name. She kept scolding me the whole time while I was giving birth to you. Can you imagine what that's like? You're giving birth to your baby and your mother is shredding you apart with her mean, cruel words. She phoned for an ambulance, but you were born before they arrived. Of course, when the EMTs arrived on the scene, my mother behaved like the most besotted mother. You were the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen after you were born. I wanted to keep you with all my heart. I begged and begged my mother to let me take care of you, to raise you as my own. But she was having no part of it. She told me I was an absolute disgrace to the family, that I'd fallen pregnant so young, that I'd brought this all on myself, based on the skimpy clothes I wore at the time. It proved that I was a hussy. My mother insisted that I was far too young to be a mother. The kindest, the most selfless and generous thing for me to do was to give you up for adoption. She told me she knew of this lovely couple at the church who were desperate to have a child of their own. The mother had been trying IVF treatments, but to no avail. The church was praying for a miracle. I knew she was right. It would be the best thing to do. I was a teenager. I had no financial means to support you, so I agreed to the adoption. I also agreed not to know the people who were adopting you, but I did receive a lovely letter from your mother in the post, thanking me for you. You see, you were really, really wanted, Jamie. I'd never have wanted to throw you away in the dumpster. Are you kidding me? I couldn't believe that your mother honoured your second name. She called you Jamie. Your first name was Lisa. I called you Lisa Jamie Wallace. So she gave you your name, Jamie. But I don't understand. Your mother said... My mother said many things, Jamie. I'm sorry to have to say this to you, but she could be a very cruel woman at times. I'm only sorry she succeeded in hurting and upsetting you when you went to visit her. But I think she did it to get her back on me. It had nothing to do with you. It was probably because I never visited her when she was sick. She was dying and I didn't know it at the time. Jamie, don't forget my mother told me you were dead. I believed her. I grieved for you every single day. My mother hated me. I think she blamed me for my father's fortuitous death when he ate a cereal she bought for me that contained traces of peanuts. After that unfortunate event, she was hell-bent on tearing me apart limb from limb. And when I was a teenager, she chose to believe the very worst of me. She told everyone that I had more boys on the side than hot dinners. And that wasn't remotely true. So you wanted me? Asked Jamie. I thought you wanted me dead. Of course I wanted you, you silly little mare, I said. and the next thing I knew, Jamie had launched herself into my arms, and we both began to sob and sob. We sat down under a tree and talked for ages. I told Jamie about Kev Passmore being her real father, how he had violated me as a teenager, and as a consequence I'd fallen pregnant. I told her that Kev Passmore and his father were no longer in life, having both been killed in a car accident. I told her that my next-door neighbour, Mrs. Passmore, was her grandmother, and unfortunately I didn't have a good relationship with her. I knew I needed to tell Jamie the truth. She was an astute young lady. She deserved to know what had happened all those years ago. I wanted a relationship with my daughter, now that I'd found her again. When I held her in my arms tightly to my chest, I felt as if a huge gaping hole in my life had at long last been filled. And however treacherous my mother may have been, she had inadvertently, unknowingly brought us together, for I may never have known that my daughter was alive. "I'm so sorry," said Jamie, "for stalking you, I mean, for sending you those really horrible notes. I was just so angry with you. I don't blame you, but I'm glad you did what you did, Jamie. Don't you see, I might never have known you were alive if you hadn't tormented me like you did. But now I hope we can have a relationship together. How do you think your parents might feel about that? I'm not sure. I'm worried my parents won't be happy, because they don't know that I know I'm adopted. You never know. Maybe they'll be relieved you actually know. Sometimes parents of adopted children probably feel they're stuck between a rock and a hard place when it comes to telling their kids the truth. They might worry about being loved less by their kids, which I know is ridiculous, because your adopted mother will always be your mother, and you need to let her know that. She needs you to know that your birth mother imposes no threat to her as a parent. You should tell them the truth about everything. Look what lies have done. They create such chaotic upheaval, don't they? Look how you believed your grandmother's lies. You thought I hated you. You thought I wanted to throw you away, when nothing could be further from the truth. It grieves my heart that your grandmother told you so many dreadful lies, especially on her deathbed. You'd think at the end of life she'd have a more repentant heart. But I'm afraid some people do leave the earth in the spite they lived in. Well, I have to say, when I met the nurse who took me up to see your mother, she told me your mother was a very angry woman. She was furious she was dying. She said your mother had been the most disagreeable patient she'd ever cared for. When I visited your mother, she delighted in telling me that you wanted to throw me away. She actually cackled like a witch. I decided in that moment I hated her as much as I thought I hated you. She was so horrible." I sighed. It saddens me to hear you say that, Jamie. You don't expect that from a dying woman. You would imagine that my mother would make her peace with everyone, especially you, as you were her grandchild. I think she was just angry with me and getting at you. Jamie nodded. Maybe she was just trying to stir up trouble. That was my mother for you, Jamie. She did love to set the cat among the pigeons. But don't let that upset you. At least now you know the truth, and that's all that matters. About my adopted parents, you're right. I need to tell them that I know I'm adopted, and that I've met my birth mother. I embraced my daughter with tears in my eyes. I could smell the apple shampoo on her long blonde hair, and when I looked into her beautiful face, I could see my father in her. I felt like the luckiest woman in the world, as I had the quintessential opportunity to get to know my daughter that I thought had died years ago. I had never got over having to give her away as a baby, and then learning of her demise had literally shattered me. Why my mother had lied to me, I do not know, but I suspect it was once again out of spite. "Listen," said Jamie. "Listen to that." We suddenly heard a chorus of delighted whoops and chatter. "Kilaki ukopo, hilani kala, dolopada, kila kula bakasa, hikana kula kwa." "What's that?" asked Jamie. I grinned. "Come with me," I said, leading Jamie by the hand towards the tree that had owned a branch that had knocked me over the previous night, but thankfully was no longer there to inflict any more lethal damage on unsuspecting parties navigating their way through the woods. I was sure I knew what we would find, And I wasn't wrong. The two female Bigfoots were rifling through the plastic bag I'd left them on the tree branch, whooping with delight at what it contained, like two kids that had found the keys to a candy shop and are stuffing their pockets with their favourite treats. The two Bigfoots ferreted enthusiastically through everything. One of the Bigfoots was eagerly stuffing her face with walnuts. They stopped when they saw me and Jamie standing together side by side. They clapped their hands enthusiastically, as if seeing old friends that they were well acquainted with. One of the Bigfoots pointed to my head. She asked me telepathically, "Better?" I nodded. "Thanks for the gift," she said. It was the least I could do, I said in my head, without articulating my thoughts loudly, because she understood everything I was thinking. Then she spoke to me in my head again and said, "It might be best if you don't visit the woods at night. Your eyes aren't really acclimatized to the moonlight. I saw the way you went flying into that tree branch." "Oh, don't worry," I replied in my head again. "My visits to the grove will be restricted to daylight hours only." "That might be better," came the reply. "Your eyes, they just aren't designed for nocturnal activities." We then watched the Bigfoots gliding through the trees, chattering happily together, and in that moment I knew I had never ever been happier. I had found my daughter. I was living in my childhood home again, and the ghosts of the past were finally behind me. In the end, it would seem my life ironed out perfectly like a crumpled piece of paper that had abandoned all its creases. I soon let my husband into the secret that I'd had a child as a teenager, and he was delighted to meet Jamie. Mrs. Passmore ended up having a relationship with her granddaughter. She even had the boldness to admit to me she knew her son Kev had raped me all those years back. My husband saw it all. It was too dreadful. He couldn't stop his son. He didn't know what to do at the time. He was devastated. I'm really sorry that Kev did that to you, Olivia." "I have no regrets, Mrs. Passmore. Your son Kev gave me Jamie, and she's a gift of God." "She sure is," said Mrs. Passmore. "I'm just glad that Jamie's parents are happy about her being involved in our lives. And I'm very glad you live next door to me as well, Olivia. I'm so sorry for all the terrible things I said to you. And I'm so sorry that your mother was such an unreasonable woman." "Don't worry about any of that. It's all in the past now," I said. "I'm just very glad that Jamie's around now, and that her parents know that she knows the truth. So there you are. That's my story."
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.